Today, I have the pleasure to talk with Gurinder Singh Mann, who is a Sikh historian and has published 3 books. The first, The British and the Sikhs, Discovery, Warfare and Friendship from the 1700s to the 1900s, as well as Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, Questions and Answers, and the final book, The Granth of Guru Gobind Singh, Essays, Lectures and Translations, which was published by Oxford University Press. He's also the director of the Sikh Museum Initiative and the curator of the Anglo Sikh Virtual Museum. On top of all of that, in his spare time, he's also an advisor for the upcoming movie, The Sikh Soldier. So, as always, thank you for making the time to have this conversation and just being here. Obviously, everyone's busy with their lives and everything else that's happening. So, no, thank you for that.
No, thank you. And I'm glad to be here, Amar Singh. And your blog spot is proving to be a very additional resource to the kind of, vast array of sources for Sikh history. So, firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to you. And also, Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh to all our listeners as well.
No, thank you. I have to admit, much of what I do is actually kind of off the back of the work that you guys are doing, because your books are on my shelves. We've had the pleasure to bump into one another before, share similar circles and sangat and stuff. So thank you for the work and the effort that you've put in over years and years and years. I'm actually quite excited to explore and find out a lot more. So we normally start with getting to find out a little bit about kind of your upbringing, your family background, how, like a lot of us, we ended up in the diaspora in wherever we are. So for argument's sake, you're based in Leicester. And then also how you ended up where you are today. So I know that's covering probably quite a lot, but let's go with that first.
Okay, so Yadamakia, so really, really pleased to be here. And just for our listeners, I really got my start. Actually, not even researching Sikhi, to be honest with you. I was actually researching history per se. I was very, very interested in learning about, say, the pyramids, for instance. I was really interested in understanding about Buddhism. I was really interested in learning about South Asian religions, like South American religions. And so therefore, growing up, you had certain bits which were given to you as from the family in terms of, what Sikh is about, what Sikh history is about, follow the usual trajectory of going to the Gurdwara and seeing the pictures of the Shaheeds and the Gurus on, in the Gurdwaras, for instance. I'm obviously born here in the UK. My parents are from Hoshiarpur and, from the Jalandhar region as well. But so they, like with most families, second generation, third generation, they could only impart a certain level of Sikh history. But for me growing up, it was personally about just learning history per se. And I always felt if you are going to tackle a subject that you're really passionate about or keen, have some kind of benchmark in a sense. Look at other world histories, look at other faiths and see what are they about, what do they kind of bring to the table, and therefore look at your own faith in context of that. And this does really bring into what our discussion today is about the Dasam Granth, but we can allude to that later. So generally growing up, learning about world histories and philosophies, and roughly about 1997 or 95, actually 1995, we're going back now, I just felt that I needed to pursue something in relation to Sikh history. And it was getting to a point where I was wanted to know a little bit more about the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. And so therefore what happened was that I enrolled onto a course or an MA in South Asian religions at the Montfort Universities, thinking, well, I'd like to research the Dasam Granth in terms of a subject, not knowing or kind of knowing that this would be a catapult into something completely different that I did not imagine or envisage. So that'll be my intro in that sense.
No, definitely. Just before you continue, I just wanted to find out what was like your initial exposure to Dasam Granth? So how were you first introduced to it? Because with, say, for argument's sake, just talking to some of the people who have messaged in over time about Dasam Granth, a lot of them, the impression that I get is that they learn about Dasam Granth far later on in life. Like we kind of grow up knowing Guru Granth Sahib Ji, Panj Pyare, Char Sahibzade, etc. And kind of we learn about Dasam Granth and everything else that goes with it almost far later. But considering you went in to do an MA with it, what was your kind of initial exposure and what was your kind of initial understanding of Dasam Granth before you'd even started to do any research?
A very good question. I think the key thing was very little, to be honest with you. But what happened was in 1995, I picked, and again, you know, when we go to the Gurdwara, you were talking to people, you've heard very little about the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. But I picked up the book by J.D. Cunningham called The History of the Sikhs, which is a very famous book. And in the back of it, he's got in the appendix, he's talking about Daswan Bashaka Granth. And I'm like, I'm a bit confused here. I've just read this book on history, a British version of History of Sikhism, and I'm getting confused. What is this Daswan Bashaka Granth? And I'm looking through the compositions. I'm saying, okay, one or two look familiar, but what is this secondary Granth? We're talking about 1995. I'm getting confused. I'm thinking, I don't understand this. I do not get what this secondary Granth is about. I read through what the compositions are about. So yeah, this is very, very interesting. And I don't understand what about this secondary Granth. So again, I started asking questions, asking people, and I was getting very either negative answers or answers like, I don't know. It was almost like we don't know much about this secondary Granth. And it was on that basis, and even when I went to, say, the Gurdwara and asked people, one or two people said, no, you don't, Nigani Uttipani, you do not want to concentrate on the Dasam Granth. I was like, hold on a second, this does not make no sense to me. And I thought, well, yeah, you're asking people a relevant question and you're not getting the answers back. And I was thinking, I don't like this. I do not want to be prepared to actually live in a calm where someone's not giving me answers. And I was hitting a few brick walls, actually. And I was thinking, okay, if that's the case, I'm going to do the subject myself then. And that is where the original kind of idea of why I went into it started from, just by asking questions, not getting the answers I wanted, and saying, well, if no one else is going to tell me, I'm going to learn it myself.
No, fair. I appreciate that. I think that's kind of what a lot of people that I've had the pleasure to talk with on the podcast, and equally myself, it's kind of like, well, you get so far with your research, you talk to so many people about it, and then you're kind of like, well, maybe I need to go and find out for myself. Maybe I need to go and do some legwork. And actually, I think the most fascinating thing is that although we're quite a young community in terms of comparison to, say, the Buddhists or other groups, we have a very detailed and quite, unfortunately or fortunately, depending how you look at it, quite a hidden history. So just in some of the random things that I've been reading, like I didn't know that there was friction between Jassa Singh Damgudi and Jassa Singh Ahluwalia, for argument's sake, the former having shot the latter through the arm at one point, which in itself, you never hear of growing up. There's kind of this traditional kind of religious narrative of that it's always kind of hunky-dory and whatever. So it's interesting to hear the similarities in that. But then, yeah, going back then obviously to you beginning this MA, were you planning when you started this to always take it down Dasam Granth, or were you just like, I'm just going to do this MA because I want to?
It was more about doing the MA and saying, I want to produce some kind of work which actually kind of looks at the compositions of the Dasam Granth. It wasn't even about authenticity. It was about, well, we have a secondary scripture called the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, and we want to actually kind of look at it and see what's its value now? What does it represent? So I wasn't even looking at authenticity. I was just looking as, well, what does it represent? So the title of my MA was The Role of the Dasam Granth in Khalsa. Very straightforward title. What does the Dasam Granth represent in Khalsa? As you kind of mentioned at the intro, is that the scripture does represent a milestone in terms of how we understand it. On the Sanjar, for instance, we know the Banis are represented in the Ardas, for instance, and we also know it represents in the Reras part and various other ceremonies and other practices and procedures related to the Khalsa. And that is just the initial view that I wanted to get across. Basically, let's get the basics first. People have always jumped in far too much into a conversation without learning the basic steps. And I've always said to people, start from the start. We live in a YouTube social media culture where people want information from A to Z in 20 seconds. This work took over 10 years, over 15 years to even get a proper solid formation of what the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib is about. And I'll be like happy to see anyone who's prepared to spend that much time looking over the whole concept of what the Dasam Granth means in relation to Khalsa and all these other kind of facets of the Dharma, and say, I'm prepared to spend my life, give up my money, give up various other things in their life just to pursue this end goal. And no, it's been a great journey, but it's been a hard journey as well. So I think initially it was just the basics, but with what was going on in the wider context of individuals who felt that the Banis of the Dasam Granth didn't represent or were not in relation to Guru Gobind Singh, then it turned into another kettle of fish and a big controversy stroke negative connotations on the Granth, which we can discuss a bit later. But initially, it was just about the very basics. What's the basic level? Because, with any subject, you can go to the nth degree to actually learn, study, understand, introspect, and then, take a lot more from it. But I think our people sometimes want the answer straight away and don't want to do any core to themselves. I have always had an issue about people saying, I will go to Wikipedia to get some information. I will go to this blog, or I will get this bit of information from just reading one book. You've got to be a Koji. That's what Guru Gobind Singh wanted our people to be. Sikh means learner, as we all know, but we all need to be Koji. You see, we have to be the people who will say, I'm going to take 5, 6, 7 hours out of my week to learn a subject. That's the concept of what Sikh is about, really, in terms of knowledge, understanding knowledge, propagating knowledge, sharing knowledge. So that's the school I come from, basically.
No, fair enough. I completely agree with that, to be honest. And I think if we all did that, the intellectual landscape of the community would be extremely different, and we'd be leaps and bounds ahead. So it's definitely a goal to strive towards. I just wanted to get a little bit deeper into your MA and just find out kind of, I know we can't necessarily explain it completely in 5 minutes, but just almost putting it into a nutshell for those listening, what were some of the conclusions of the outcomes of your MA? And then a second question is, what were the primary sources that you used? Where did you go? Like, how difficult was it getting hold of some of the sources? Did you find any of the kind of challenges or anything that was a surprise? So for argument's sake, coming across something which kind of challenged the usual historical narrative, although I'm sure there were loads dealing with Dasam Granth. And yeah, anything else that perhaps is of interest in relation to your MA?
Well, like I said, primarily the idea was just to kind of shine the light onto how the Dasam Granth Sahib is actually represented within the Khalsa. So the idea being, what's the Banis which are represented in, like I said, the Nityanam, for instance, what's the Banis which are represented in the Reras, what's the Banis which are represented in terms of, even the Ardas itself, because as we know, the Ardas, the first couple of lines of body come from Dandi Divar, and it's so significant that the Ardas, and a lot of people still don't even realize that the Ardas is composed of lines from the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. So it was just very simple ideas which I wanted to kind of just get across in the MA, but at the same time had to look at the authenticity kind of issue or question as well. And from the sources I looked at, and this was what we call primary literature, whether that be some early Sarups. I didn't go too much into the Sarups at that particular time, but also secondary literature as well. And obviously, the question comes, is this the work of Guru Gobind Singh? Is this the Rachana of the Guru, or is it the Kavi's work, etc., and all these other kind of questions which come or have been coming through the sidelines for many years. But there was no question in my mind during the late 90s, when I started in 1997, looking at it and took the MA in 1999 and completed in 2001, that the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh, which we call the Daswan Pasha Ka Granth, also known as the Dasam Granth, was the Rachana of Sri Guru Gobind Singh Ji. There was no doubt in my mind, based on some sources in terms of scriptures, some sources in terms of early kind of ityas, and some sources in terms of secondary sources, but also practice as well. But we can talk about practice later. The difficulty level was immense, because you've got to remember, there was the internet was just in its infancy. Okay, so it's in its infancy. So a scholar learning now compared to then, you've got no chance. If you got 100 people now doing what I did at that time, it was very, very difficult. So the internet was there. There was a couple of sources which I could pick up on, and then I realized which kitaban I could actually obtain and get. I started making contacts with people in India as well at that time as well. And generally, that is how I did this. If I had the resources now, which I had then it would be a different kind of product. But at the same time, in a way, I'm glad I didn't have those things, because in a way, it made me a better scholar for the future. How do you formulate an argument? How do you look at just a few sources and what conclusions can you draw from them? Even if later on you may have to change them or modify them, but it's still a finite set of resources for where you can actually come up to a conclusion. So for me, the fieldwork was zero at that particular time, which is completely different to the work I do now. It is completely field work that I do in terms of looking at all the work I do in terms of Sikh history and heritage. So it just shows you, whereas even now, people are not what they call field scholars. Field scholar is someone who will go out there in the field, and I don't mean literally in the field, but will go out there, research information, go to a library, go to another library, go into a village, interview people, speak to people, make 50 phone calls just about one subject. This is what scholarship's all about. None of this internet kind of thing, let me get 20 sources and put a essay together. That is fine if you want to write an essay, but that is not fine if you want to be a great Sikh scholar in terms of actually encompassing a vast range of sources to get a complete product.
No, fair. So obviously you've done your MA, you've worked through that, you've been introduced to the Dasam Granth, you've obviously managed to put your arguments together, the MA together, you published it in 2001. Now, considering obviously this is kind of obviously early on in the days of the internet, what was the response to the MA, considering, I guess, up until yourself and perhaps Komaru, there hasn't been really a Dasam Granth scholar or historian really from the community, other than perhaps Jaggi, whose views are sometimes kind of misconstrued depending on who you're talking to. So what was the reaction to your MA when it was published? And also, what was perhaps your understanding or your view of those who had written about Dasam Granth prior to you?
Okay, so the first question in terms of the response, well, you got to remember that at that particular time, you know, like I said, if I was trying to get my head around the subject, then others were also. So trying to explain to people what you'd done was a challenge in itself. So that was the first thing. But what I did was something completely novel. I'd already been working in IT at that particular time, and I'd created my own website, and I'd uploaded the whole MA in 2001. And I had a contact information, etc. And I started getting emails from people in India. So one of the first people I got in contact with me was Gurinder Singh Mann from the editor of Sabha. And he actually contacted me and said, your work is so great that we need to get you to start doing a lot more work and producing a lot more in the future. So that was from an India perspective, and the word got out in India in terms of what I'd actually created. In the UK, it's slightly different. It took a bit longer for people to recognize what I'd actually done and what I actually achieved as well. You got to remember at the time, there was still, though, it was at the not infancy, but there was still the decade where debates had started and had already been started. Well, some debates started in the early 90s, actually, and this was the late 90s, early 2000. So the response was great. People were saying, yeah, it's a great piece of work you've done, but they still did not understand it, did not understand the level that this MA would do. And just to put it in perspective, this was the first work in the Western world, really, to look at the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. There was an earlier work by C.A. Llewellyn related to the Dasam Granth, but he was actually, whilst he was based in America, he'd actually done the work in India itself. So this was the first work which actually looked at this subject. As you're probably aware that, as the Sikh field had grown and, since the 1960s in the UK, America, there was scholars who looked at the Guru Granth Sahib and other facets of the Sikh world. But in terms of the Dasam Granth, this was the first work that's been published. So the response was originally just slow, but it did develop over the period of the early 2000s, basically.
Okay. Now, considering the amount of work and effort and time you've put into Dasam Granth, why do you think certain scholars are hesitant to attribute Dasam Granth to Guru Gobind Singh? Like, I understand I completely understand their arguments and I see their perspectives. I don't necessarily think it holds water. Why do you think that's been the case? Is it just being historically accurate in the sense of it's kind of, their argument is kind of, it's more likely than not, rather than being, oh, I can 100% say it is? Or is it just because they haven't necessarily seen the sources or put in the fieldworks, like yourself, into this topic?
I would go one further and say sitting on the fence is a really easy kind of position to have when it comes to a difficult subject. So if I'm writing about it, and if my peers, or if you think a generation of people are possibly veering on a different side, you can just sit on the fence and say, well, X, Z, and Y, and therefore, I'm in the middle, so therefore I don't get any flack from either side, if that makes sense. And that is what a lot of scholars have done. They'll sit on the fence and they'll say, well, could be, possibly, maybe, or they'll say certain portions of the Baniya represent Guru Gobind Singh Rachana, and, the idea is there. But yeah, quite correctly, there's not been that many Dasam Granth scholars in terms of reading the whole plethora of literature from the time of Guru Gobind Singh to the present day. So there's only a handful of people on the planet who really know the sources related to Sri Dasam Granth. So some people aren't going to stick their neck out and put a position, but some professors and people who are within university institutions maybe are veering on the side of caution as well. But if you look at the India side, Indian scholars have actually from Punjab universities on one side have actually quite categorically said that's the work is a Rachana of Guru Gobind Singh, and they have no issue with that. And the debates have got fierce. They were fierce during the late 90s, the 2000s, but I think people like to just sort of sit on the fence, really. That's my personal position, because it doesn't affect them, so they can do and talk about other subjects. Because what you got to realize is at a certain point in time earlier on in the 90s and 2000s, people put you in two camps. You were either a believer in the Bani, or you weren't, and so therefore then this even started calling you a Dasam Granth scholar, which makes no sense, because you're a scholar in various fields. But my initial field might have been Dasam Granth, but I've branched out to just so many different areas of Sikh history and heritage. So, but people like polemics. They like the yin and the yang, the black and the white, because it puts people in groups. And unfortunately, that is what actually sets people up for either for greatness or either for failure. But personally, I think a lot of people sat on the fence during that time. They're still sitting on the fence now because they don't want to call it. It'll affect their career. It'll forget who represents them, etc., etc. So that's my kind of bottom line in terms of where some of these scholars sit.
Just being devil's advocate then in relation to this conversation, do you also perhaps think that it's a conflict of narratives, in the sense that you have a religious view or religious bias on one hand, wanting the Dasam Granth to be authentic and the 100% the work of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, and then you have the flip side, which is kind of a historical narrative in its kind of truest academic sense, in that it's kind of looking at the evidence, again, like putting aside the limitations of the evidence that has been looked at and gathered and all the rest of it, but it's almost looking at the evidence and saying, well, it's more likely than not to have been the work of Guru Gobind Singh Ji. Again, just being devil's advocate.
I think, look, you have got those different viewpoints, and you've got those different ways of interpreting a subject. So yeah, scholarship, if you look at it in terms of Sikh studies, for instance, yeah, you have to have both sides of the argument, so therefore you can try and come up with a conclusion. The religious side, if you look at it, is always going to be about faith or non-faith of something. You're either going to believe it and say, this is the Rachana of Guru Gobind Singh, or you're going to say, based on my limited understanding or the content of the Granth Sahib, here's my conclusion to what I believe. So yeah, there is this tension between the two kind of thought processes. However, the answer is still the same. What are the actual sources for or the praxis of the Bani of Guru Gobind Singh and how's it played out. Not necessarily now, but how did it play out from the time of Guru Gobind Singh during the misl period, Ranjit Singh period, and so forth, Sodhak Committee period, which is later 1800s, Singh Sabha period. And unfortunately, not many people can go through that amount of literature or those evidence sources because it's just so vast. And that's why it even took me many years to get to the bottom of it. If I was going to create a great piece of work, whether it's through my MA, the 2 books, for instance, with Dr. Kamrup Singh, it was a lot of work. And, and most people would not be prepared to even go down that avenue because it's just too difficult. It's a very, very complex subject in terms of researching, not necessarily in terms of understanding. Let me just make that viewpoint very clear.
Okay, no problem. Just before we move on then, I just want to get your opinion on the work of Dr. Ratan Singh Jaggi, and then secondly, the work of Robin Reinhart. From what I can gather, their arguments seem to be more based in kind of a limitation of resource a limitation of sources and also a limitation of contextual understanding, because I think some of the conclusions are almost based in a modern day perspective or kind of a modern moral sense of what is right and wrong. Just obviously from someone like yourself working in the field and with all of the years of putting in the hard work, what is your perspective of their works?
Okay, let me just make a correction here first in terms of Jaggi. Dr. Ratan Singh Jaggi, original work came out around about 62, 65, around about that period. That is when he originally produced his work on the Dasam Granth. And let me tell you the story how this all went out. Essentially, in Punjab University, Patiala, somebody by the name of Dr. Ashtar had already done a PhD, and it was called The Poetry of the Dasam Granth. Jaggi Sahib had also elected to do a PhD after Ashtar, but he wanted to do a positive piece, but they said Ashtar's already done a piece on the Dasam Granth, which is looking at the positive side. So he did his PhD intentionally to look at the negative side because that was the only way he could do a PhD. And this is fact, because within a year of his his PhD coming out, he controverts it by saying it is the Rachana of Guru Gobind Singh. 1 year later. And so therefore, the idea there was he looked at, and that's why he only looked at a number of sources. So for instance, he only looked at a couple of sarups and he said, well, there's only a couple of sarups, so therefore we can't conclude X, Z, and Y. He talked about the Prakash of Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth and made up some kind of, there was not even no evidence for what he was trying to say. So he was coming at, I don't think he was even coming about it in the right way. His work was just to get himself a PhD. So then eventually he controverted it anyway. And in 1991, just to make it clear, he actually did the translations of the Dasam Granth Sahib in Punjabi in Delhi under the Bhai Gobind Sadan, I think, organization. And in there, he's positive about it as well. So the idea of Jaggi and his work is a misnomer, basically. He wasn't even trying to do anything. It's just that people picked up on his work because it was negative or in the anti, and then his arguments carried through. You never see Dr. Ratan Singh Jaggi talk about the Dasam Granth. He's never done an interview hardly in relation to the Dasam Granth. And why is that? Because he knows what he did. Galti in the 60s was exactly that. It was a different level. Now, turning to Dr. Robin Reinhart, who I have a lot of respect for, actually, believe it or not, because I know Reinhart and I knew exactly the way she was approaching the subject. She was approaching the Dasam Granth and in the way of linguistics. Okay, she deals with languages, so she was approaching it from the Hindi language. Okay, so even though she talks about authenticity, she talks about other facets of the Banis, her specialism is linguistics. It's about Hindi poetry. So therefore, she was looking at it from that angle. So therefore, she cannot make that conclusion about authenticity. And even then, she quotes Jaggi as well, which is the only criticism I can really make about her. But in terms of her actually understanding and talking about Jutta Pakyan, that was great. I think that she puts that on a level in terms of what it represents. even some of the avatars she talks about, some of the conclusions look all right to me, but she's still sitting on the fence after all of that, looking at all the information, and which is very interesting because I just mentioned someone called Dr. Ashtar, and he looked at a similar subject. He looked at the poetry of the Dasam Granth, and he was a linguist. He looked at it from a linguistic point of view as well. And he basically said, if I take composition X, if I take composition Y, it's quite clear by the style of the writing, the metaphors that use, that this is the rachana of one individual and with one pen. He compared all the different Banis from the language point of view, Braj Bhasha, looking at other languages, and that was his conclusion. So I'm a bit miffed as to why Robert Reinhart come up with that conclusion based, even though she quotes Dr. Ashtar as well. So from my point of view, the two scholars just had different ways of approaching the subject and not necessarily in the right way or coming up with the right conclusions.
Fair enough. Okay, no, that's really useful to know. Just then, obviously moving on. This kind of brings us just to the last question before we move into the historic evidence and kind of the development of Dasam Granth. Is the two conferences, the first one in 2008 and the second in 2016?
Yeah, so what actually happened was, like you said, what was the development and what was the feedback from the MA? This kind of grew from the MA. I know 2001 and 2008 sounds like 7 years, but what happened was that the controversy was getting fever pitch. So a group of individuals in America got together and said, well, we need to get some scholars to rebut some of the accusations in relation to the Bani. I was invited from the UK, and I felt really privileged in 2008 to be giving my vichar on the Dasam Granth Sahib. A guy from Leicester, I don't consider myself to be any more special than anybody else, but to be on the same platform as, ex-Jathadars of the Takht Keshkar Sahib, and we had scholars at that time. We had Dr. Harpal Singh Pannu from Punjabi University, Patiala, and other individuals as well. So in 2008, when I did that Sri Dasam Granth, that was the first, let me put this in context, it was the first Sri Dasam Granth Sahib conference globally which looked at different facets of the Granth Sahib. And in that conference, I personally still think to this date that was the first time when I could actually talk about the Sarup. So my initial findings from 2001, I'd actually learned about the Sarups then as well. So I talked about some of the earliest Sarups on the Dasam Granth, or in that lecture I gave, talked about the Ityas. I even started talking about transmission as well. This is 2008. I'd already come up with the idea of where some of these ideas and concepts were going and where we needed to go and how we educate the public in terms of, what Guru Gobind Singh Rachana actually means. So 2008 for me felt like a milestone in terms of the manuscripts, the historical aspects, the Ityas. I think I'd got it to a T in 2008, and that's why I felt that lecture at that particular time was absolutely great, and also to share with the peers. And I felt really humbled at that particular point in my life to actually have shared that knowledge at that time. The idea, like I said, was to combat all the negative connotations. Moving on from that wasn't the first one. There's been 3 conferences actually. 2016 was the other one as well, and that was also great as well. It was just talking and getting scholars all on stage and talking about the Sri Dasam Granth from different perspectives. It could, like I said, you can evaluate the Granth Sahib from Sarups, you can from Ityas from the time of Guru Gobind Singh, you can talk about praxis, you can talk about the relics and artifacts and the transmission. So it's great to have a different viewpoint in terms of how you approach the subject. So I think those kind of conferences were fantastic, and they're all available on YouTube as well. So it's great for people to go back and actually listen and watch and see the vichar of all these Budwan as well. But I think interestingly, one of my greatest ones, believe it or not, was in 2018, actually, just recently, was at Badni Kala in the Punjab, where all the different sampradaya came together. So we're talking about the Nahangs, Nirbale, Yadasis, even the SGPC were there, and where I gave my vichar. And again, the only person from the UK was called to this massive conference in Badni Kala to give my vichar on Sri Dasam Granth Sahib and how it works in terms of the transmission. So it was a great lecture in terms of how the Dasam Granth has actually propagated itself through relics and artifacts, the Shastras, the Jarainas, and I know you may be going to ask me about that a bit later, but that was one of my great lectures which I gave in 2018. So yeah, I've always felt privileged. I never thought to myself, what I'm doing is bigger or better than anybody else. I just felt that I need to bring to the table new concepts, new ideas, new ways of thinking, because people look at scholarship from different vantage points. And unfortunately, you have to correct your Badwans as well sometimes. And I would say that with the greatest amount of respect. And a case in point is the idea of the Bhai Mani Singh bead. And I know we're going to talk about manuscripts as well, but, in terms of there's always been this long fallacy that the Bhai Mani Singh bead was the original bead related to the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. So, you've got to go back and, challenge the people who think they're saying the right things, but say it in a nice way and present the information whereby you're not just challenging individuals, you're actually embracing and trying to show them PR and saying, well, this is what we think and this is the way that you should approach this subject as well. But like you mentioned earlier on, the plethora of sources, you really have to go to detail in order to understand the subject fully.
I think that kind of nicely moves us on to talking about kind of the historic development of Sri Dasam Granth and the evidence and the research and everything else that you've done in your time. Obviously, again, to put the books together, you'd have to have put in a lot of legwork. Just before moving into that next section, I just wanted to check, is there anything in particular that you may want to include in this part or just want to go over, or anything we've missed out?
No, I think the early development was just about actually understanding the sources, like we mentioned. It was all about understanding if there is a controversy, what is the controversy? And thirdly, being part of various major conferences where I could outline what I thought was the way to approach the subject as well. So I think that nicely concludes or leads to the next question you're going to be asking.
Yeah, sure. Okay. There's actually just one question that I want to ask perhaps before we then go through these. Yeah. I just wanted to ask, and how did you go from doing your MA, doing your research, to then ending up publishing 2 books that are entirely based about Dasam Granth? Because I would love to get to know, obviously, the groundwork that goes into putting such work together. But secondly, it'd be really interesting for those listening to find out what you had to do, what you came across, in a nutshell, I guess, what the books kind of suggest. And I guess within some of that, I know we're going to talk about the historic development of Dasam Granth in a minute, but I guess that kind of lends itself to that next section.
It's a really good question. I mean, I think what happened was I was getting emails weekly, daily, and then as the internet was progressing as well, and it was the same questions. It was like, what's the Dasam Granth? What's the Barneys involved in Dasam Granth? Concepts about Sri Bhagwati Ji Sahai, and it was the same question day in, day out. So a couple of years later, I'd actually met with a researcher called Gurinder Singh, and he had embarked on his MPhil basically around the same subject. So I'd actually suggested to him that it would be great to actually write a book called The Question and Answers, because we're getting the same question, getting the same, and the answers are the same. So let's just create a book. So we started working on Sri Dasam Granth's Question and Answer. But interestingly, we started also working on the secondary book as well at the same time, which is the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh. Now, the interesting thing was that in terms of the book that we published called The Granth of Guru Gobind Singh, Essay, Lectures and Translations, that was pitched to Oxford University Press. And what you got to imagine is that I didn't work at no university. Guru Singh didn't work no university. We're not in no big, massive, influential kind of group that we're getting this book published. And this was all legwork to get our book published with Oxford University Press. And we did this. It was a massive achievement in terms of getting the book published. And I thought it was a great milestone in terms of where we are in terms of the subject. Well, I think the 2 books were very separate in terms of what they were trying to achieve. The first book, the Q&A, was about literally the basic questions. Even now, and you know this as well, Amar, is that this book, people still want to read it even today. published in 2011. You know how often people are asking yourself, but they're asking me. Unfortunately, it's not out of print, but there's only limited copies of it. But to this day, people are saying, I want to read this book because it's a nice introductory guide in terms of, asking simple questions, which people are still asking today. But the secondary book was all about the actual, and if I could allow me to say it, the meat on the bone in terms of what the subject's about. What are the original manuscripts? What is the ityas? What are we talking about in terms of the prakash of the Granths? What are we talking about in terms of, how the Dasam Granth is proliferated across the world in terms of what it means, not just to the individuals, but with the worldwide view as well. So the secondary book was equally important, but in a different way. So I think working with individual like Guru Singh was a great blessing as well. And in a way, it was great. Like I said, in terms of my hands, I can only count a number of individuals who have really gone into depth on the subject. And therefore, by pooling our resources together was a great opportunity. It was hard work as well. And I'm sure he would say as well, it was difficult. But at the same time, we produced two great books, I think, which actually gets to the crux and leads to the conclusions which we thought were really important to actually kind of disseminate to people all around the world. And you got to remember, the book, the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh, Essays, Lectures and Translations, is in university libraries all across the world. So personally, myself, I felt that I've done my justice for Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj in terms of making sure that his Bani is actually protected. And I use that word very cautiously, protected, because no one was protecting the Bani during, if I can use the word, the Dasam Granth wars. It was very polemic. The idea was not to get away, was to get away from this polemic debate about, is this the work of Guru Gobind Singh? Is this not? It was all about the sources. And I think that's what I was trying to achieve, and with Dr. Guru Singh, but also trying to get my views, thoughts together as well in these projects.
Just before we move on into the historic development of Sri Dasam Granth, it'd just be worth mentioning that we've got the Q&A book on the shop. The essays translations book is at the moment quite difficult to get hold of, but I think you might be able to get it on Amazon. Equally, there's a book review on the Q&A book that you can read as well, which I'll share the link to in the description. But anyway, moving on then into the kind of the meat of this podcast, which is the historic development of Sri Dasam Granth. So I'm just going to start with two particular primary sources, recensions, manuscripts that we discussed prior to this, which is the Anandpur Bead from 1695, and then a recension that was sent to Patna Sahib dated 1698, with handwritten pages of Sri Guru Gobind Singh Ji. So could you perhaps then explain in a couple of minutes the physical historical evidence? Obviously, we've just mentioned two, which we can begin with, and then any others that you've obviously come across during your research.
I think the first thing to bear in mind is that there's a plethora of manuscripts from the time of Sri Guru Gobind Singh, during the misl period, Ranjit Singh period, etc., etc. There is this idea that there's only a handful of sarups. There's only 4 sarups, which Jaggi was talking about, for instance. There is a plethora of manuscripts, either, let me clarify this, either in the hand or partly in the hand of Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj, the Shaheeds in relation to the Khalsa, and other important individuals. And this is fact. This is not even a debate, because Ityas also backs up this information as well. So let's start off with the Anandpuri bead, for instance. Firstly, I'd like to say there's hardly anyone on the planet who's even seen the Anandpuri bead. I've been very, very privileged to have seen the Xerox copies of this sarup, because it's in a private collection. No one knows where it's at. We try to even find out what actually happened from the last owners of the sarup or the custodians. But I was lucky to actually study the Anandpuri bead. So firstly, let me just explain what that bead is and what it represents. Firstly, it's a prototype. It's a work in progress, which Guru Gobind Singh had actually started with his Kavis. And what I mean by that was he'd started writing some of the works and the Kavis were putting it into shape in terms of a final form. That's why we have Shuddh. And let me explain what Shuddh means. Shuddh means actual corrections as well. Now, in the field of Sikhi, it sounds very controversial that corrections could be made to Banis, for instance. And this is not correction in terms of the work, it's correction in terms of how the scribes have actually written it down. So the Rachana, of Guru Gobind Singh would have been orated, the scribes would have tried to have written it, and then what would have happened was they would have actually corrected it because based on their fallacies, they could not correctly anticipate or did not have the knowledge at that time to actually comprehend what the Guru Sahib was saying. So an Anantapuri bead is a work in progress bead. So that's why you do have dates such as, 1695 and 1696, if I remember correctly. And we also have the names of the scribes as well. I think one's Nihal, for instance, and we also have Bhai Haridas. And let me explain who Bhai Haridas was. Haridas Sahib was the grandfather of Jassa Singh Ramgarhia. And we talk about Bhai Mani Singh, we talk about Baba Deep Singh, but Haridas Sahib was one of those missing scribes who's been deleted or not known about, but he wrote recensions of the Guru Granth Sahib, and he was a scribe of this particular Anantapuri bead as well. So it's a very, very important find, which many decades ago I looked into, and I thought, this is the kind of research we need. We need to talk about Bhai Haridas. He's written sarups, which are very hard to find now, but he was at the forefront of not just, or should I say, he was at the forefront of recensions of Guru Granth Sahib and the Dasam Granth as well, which is absolutely interesting because just like Bhai Mani Singh involved in Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, and that is what the essence of being the scribe, being in terms of a scholar was about. It's not we deal with one Granth as you would have led to believe in this present day. The scribes, the workers, the individuals, the Gyanis all knew about the knowledge that was there at that particular time. So the Anantapuri bead, in a nutshell, prototype Granth, including the handwriting and the verses, including Jarta Pakyan in the hand. So there's corrections made by Guru Gobind Singh in his own hand within that bead. And there's something within the bead called Khas Patre. What Khas Patre alludes to is the words and the writings by Guru Gobind Singh in his own hand, Khas Patre, which were included in that bead as well. Obviously, there's some kind of stop and start in terms of how that surup was made, but it is a prototype leading to the formulation of other Granths or other variations of the Granths. Variations is the wrong word. It's more about leading to an established surup, for instance. Now, you mentioned about the Patna Sahib Sarup of 16.
Sorry, quickly, just before we move on to the Patna Sahib bead, I wanted to actually ask you two things. First of all, I wanted to ask you, do you think the Anantapur bead, I know you've said you've seen a Xerox copy, but do you think it still exists?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. 100%.
Okay, and it's in someone's private collection, but it's very difficult to ascertain where.
100%. I've even got images from that Sarup that has been given to me through various and this was years ago as well. So we know it exists. We've even, and I don't want to go too much into detail as to,
sure,
but the Sarup does exist, and I've even had pictures from the Sarup sent to me.
Okay. And then the second question, which again, this has just come off the back of the conversation, and this is why I enjoy doing this, which is, you mentioned that the Anantapur bead had a kind of a distinctive way within which it was made. Now, I've never actually researched or even thought about looking into how these Granths were compiled and the kind of the technology behind actually creating the paper and the ink and binding it and everything else that goes with it. Now, I don't know whether you've researched this in your time, and I'm assuming you have, but could you perhaps explain in like a nutshell what some of the methods were behind actually creating the Granth?
Okay, so it's a very important question because there's similarities in terms of how Guru Granth Sahib manuscripts would have been compiled. There's other kind of works as well, whether it's by Gurdas or whether it's the work of other individuals as well, even by Nandlal, for instance, as well. And even the Kavis, and we can touch upon the Kavis a bit later, but the idea was that Guru Gobind Singh would undertake his Vachana. The scribes would try to actually emulate or understand what the Guru Sahib was saying and then write this down. The paper, in terms of formulation, was very, whilst we had the early Guru Granth Sahib Swarups. Now, just to put this in context, we're talking about a Granth called the Dasam Pasha Ka Granth being written at the same time as the Guru Granth Sahib is being formalized. Let's get this correct so people understand this. The Guru Granth Sahib is still being compiled in the sense that Guru Gobind Singh designates it as Guru, designates and adds the Bani of Guru Tegh Bahadur to Guru Granth Sahib, and at the same time he's writing his own Bani. And I'm not even going to go into the question, I'm not even going to answer it, why Guru Gobind Singh's Bani was not put into the Guru Granth Sahib. That's not even a question, personally. But, so when Guru Gobind Singh is writing his own Bani, the paper formulation took place at that time. The scribes were brought in to finalize the Guru Granth Sahib, at the same time formalize and start preparing Swarups in terms of the Dasam Granth and other manuscripts as well. So that's when you start getting this initial, even though it was during the time of Guru Arjan Dev, possibly a bit later than Guru Arjan Dev's time, but the Swarups start getting a bit more elaborate in terms of the sense that the calligraphy style is changed. There's certain patterns being put in terms of the initial folios of the Granth Sahibs as well, especially in terms of the initial folios, if that makes sense. And originally, the Swarups did take on the persona of ideas of the Islamic faith as well, the style, if that makes, of, you know, the introductions, for instance. I'm talking about the style of the Swarups. So, and when we talk about recipes, and let's put this in context as well, in many Swarups, they talk about what kind of ink was prepared, how it was prepared, and what we call in the original, we call it contents, but it's not contents, but, you know, in the introductions, you get a lot of information in terms of, in some cases, dates, times, scribes, etc. And it's really, really important. But what's even more important is you could have a scribe who's written a Granth Sahib, scribed a Granth Sahib, let's just say in relation to Guru Granth Sahib, and he's put a date on it, but the same scribe has also done a Swarup of the Dasam Granth, but not put a date on it. But because we know he's written X, from that idea we can figure out why. And this happens quite a lot, actually, believe it or not, in Sikh history, where we know one scribe is the writer of 2 Granths or 3 Granths, even though there's only one date in one Swarup as well. So the whole subject of writing the Swarups is fascinating in itself, which I did take a lot of understanding and a lot of interest in my early days, not as much now, but it is a very fascinating subject. And again, there's only a handful of people who really know the subject of manuscripts and what they entail and how the history can be, well, Sikh history can be developed just on manuscripts itself. It's a very, very, a very niche subject, but an important subject.
Sorry, just quickly before moving on to the Patna Sahib recension, I just wanted to ask you, have you come across any other texts or granths that were compiled or written during, at the Darbar of Guru Gobind Singh Ji?
In terms of, Dasam Granth Sahib, did you say? Or
no, sorry, I just mean in general. So any other texts. So for argument's sake, I know there's like Sanapati wrote Guru Sobha. There's other Kavis and people who are writing other texts or translating other texts. So I just wanted to get an idea of what, like, you may have come across something quite particular and unique. So for argument's sake, the fact that you're one of the very few people on the planet to have seen the Anandpur Bead, let alone it being a Xerox copy, but the fact you've seen it is quite interesting to me. So I just wondered if there's anything quite unique or interesting that you may have come across in relation to texts coming from the Darbar of Guru Gobind Singh Ji.
You asked me a question earlier on about development. You asked me a question about what I actually learned. Well, one of the comparisons that I did was look at Kavis, okay? The Kavis of Guru Gobind Singh, who were they and what did they actually write? That was an early part of the development because I felt that some of the questions which were stated or positions were stated was that the Rachna of Guru Gobind Singh is by the Kavis. So therefore I said, well, okay, let's look at the Kavis' work. So I started to look at the work of Kavi Kankan, Bhai Nandlal, looked at Gavresh, for instance. You know, we talk about Bhavanji Kavis, so 52 poets of Guru Gobind Singh, but Bhavanja Kavi means, 52. But really, if you look at the work of Pyara Singh Padam, we're talking about 125 scribes and Kavis from that particular time period. So what I looked at was what is available at that particular time. So if we look at the works like the Hitopadesha, the Upanishads, Mahabharata, which were actually written in the court of Guru Gobind Singh, what do we actually establish? And not just from these three texts, but other texts as well. We can draw some important conclusions. The Kavis had actually, many of them had actually been serving at the court of Aurangzeb, for instance. They'd been banished from there because Aurangzeb at that time had actually wanted people to convert. So many Kavis, including Bhai Nandlal, had actually moved from the court of Aurangzeb, a very important facet, showing how important Guru Gobind Singh was at the time of Aurangzeb, a very powerful emperor. And there we have Guru Gobind Singh here challenging this ideal, these norms and ideas. And the Kavis want to flock to his court, the Darbar at Paonta Sahib, for instance, the Darbar at Anandpur Sahib, for instance. Absolutely, that's just mind-boggling in itself. But if we look at his works, but also the other thing to bear in mind is some Kavis were inherited. People do not understand that some of the Kavis attached to the Darbar of Guru Gobind Singh were inherited from the Darbar of Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib as well. So there's this actual duality taking place. But going back to your question in terms of the works, firstly, what we find is in the Kavi's work is they actually do not say or do not use a word like, they use the word maybe Ikamgar, but they do not say Ikamgar, why would you Fateh, for instance. They talk about Sri Ganesha, they talk about the Devte and the Devis as their Manglacharan. Very important point. So whilst we talk about Sri Bhagwati Sahai in certain compositions, they're talking about Sri Ganesha. They are praising their Hindu deities first, writing the text, and within the first portion or at the end, they are actually quite categorically stating that we have written this within the court of Guru Gobind Singh. And we are praising Guru Gobind Singh for giving us this opportunity, because Guru Gobind Singh, what he's trying to do is actually create a legion of not just saint soldiers, but learners in various types of information, whether it's, but like I said about Upanishads, we're talking about different types of Rajniti, and these poets, these Kavis were paid more than the actual, the soldiers. For me, that is actually the most indicative statement to actually say that if you, as a Sikh, is not a learner, then you are actually going against what Guru Gobind Singh is actually talking about. He created this darbar, he created these symposiums of discussing literature, the world literature as well, not just Indian literature, or Persian literature, or Eastern world literature, and discussing it and talking about this. And the Kavis had created this amount of work, which even to this day is surpassed in terms of not understanding what they wrote and what it's all about. We have missed a trick of what Guru Gobind Singh was saying because we focus too much on, and quite rightly we should do, on Bani, but we do not understand the physical, the political, the spiritual basis of what the court was about. Because what he's trying to do is say these writings are important in themselves, but as within the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, what Guru Sahib does is he reinterprets all these myths, these ideas, the ideas of Chandi, Krishna, and brings them to a fore. But at the same time, he's saying to all these individuals, if you have a great book, if you have a great story, you need to come to my darbar and you need to show me what this literature is about.
Just going back to, you mentioned that there's almost a common assumption that it's 52 poets. Where does this kind of idea come from, and why is 52 attributed to so many kind of elements in Sikh history? I'm assuming there's some association or some reason behind the number 52, but how come that's kind of bandied about so much?
With everything in Sikh history later on, I'm not talking about early period, I'm not talking about between 1700 and 1800, I'm talking about a lot later, concepts in numbers start to formulate in themselves. You know, we talk about the 5Ks, for instance, and Panj becomes a very important factor. Bhavanja also becomes a factor as well. And what happens is it's almost like trying to equate a number, so therefore it becomes popular. But like I mentioned earlier on, manuscript history, the development of manuscripts throws these concepts out the way sometimes, and it challenges sometimes what other individuals are trying to portray. So, for instance, if we are talking about Bhavanji Kavi, it's there in literature all the time. Bhavanja Kavi all the time. It's simply not true, because it's a common concept, but common concepts do not meet with the actual groundwork at that particular time. Maybe the individuals at that time did not know, but for me, it's always about if it challenges certain atiyats in a certain point in time. Well, that's what it is. Basically, we should not mince our words, and unfortunately, the problem with our GOM has always been, if it's something difficult, let's sweep it under the rug, or let's pretend it didn't happen or doesn't exist because it's too complex to actually kind of explain. And I think that's a very bad indictment of the way we live.
No, fair enough. I just then wanted to ask you another thing, which is you mentioned that some of the scholars would invoke Hindu deities, etc. Now, just from your understanding and your research, what are your perspective, what is your opinion on kind of the religious boundaries or the religious construction at that time? Because obviously there's work like Khaja Oberoi, which kind of indicates that it was far more syncretic and kind of less communal, I guess, is an easy way of putting it into a nutshell. But from the research that you've done and your understanding, what would your opinion be of kind of the landscape at the time?
Well, okay, so you got to remember, from the time of Guru Nanak, what is going on in the Sikh faith? The idea is you're living in a construct of faith which is based on Indic, maybe not use the word Hindu, but Indic cosmologies in terms of, you know, what the ground level understanding of Dharam is about, for instance. So we're talking about, and again, we use sources in terms of, what the deities of that time was, whether it be Krishna, Jandi, and others. But at the same time, we have a situation where India and Pakistan, subcontinent, is under Islamic rule as well. So you have Islamic concepts coming in there as well. So from the time of Guru Nanak all the way through to Guru Arjan Dev and Guru Hargobind, up to the time of Guru Gobind Singh, there's all these challenges which are meted out in terms of what Bani represents. So when we get to a point where the Kavis are writing as well, there is this challenge as to what this information represents to the common person. So the common person looks at the Sikhs and some may think of it as an anomaly and thinking, well, how is this different from what we have already seen? Is the Sikh concept a sect? And I know the word sect is a very Western concept, but you've got to remember that in India at that time, there was different denominations of all faiths at that particular time. So what Guru Gobind Singh is doing and trying to challenge is the established order at that time. The established order of Khande de Bol, or making someone a Khalsa, did challenge it, because prior to that time, and what happened was at the time of the Shahidi of Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, was that individuals weren't a visible force, even though Guru Hargobind Sahib had also had battles with the Mughals, which many people still don't dwell on because they don't really know. But in terms of a established order, in terms of what represented the Sikh was actually in relation to the Shahidi of Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, but also understanding and bringing the concepts and ideas to a level where individuals from any faith could seem to understand what Guru Sahib's talking about. So, for instance, in Bajata Natak, he's talking about Apni Katha and he's trying to reinterpret the cosmology of faiths. All the different Dandibanis, Krishna Avatar, Rudra Avatar, all these other concepts, he's trying to tell them, as in the populace, do not look at your Chandi, your Krishna, as being the person which you just believe in, because the Hindu faith at that particular time was on its knees. There's mass persecution taking place under, the Islamic faith under Aurangzeb at that particular time. And what Guru Gobind Singh was saying, if you believe in Chandi, believe in the concept of the warfare of Chandi, believe in the concept of Krishna in terms of what the war aspects are about. He was drawing out certain portions which could apply to individuals, where the masses were down on their knees. This idea of Sant Sabai was a very, very, not unique in the world level in terms of like duality, but unique at that time, because for people to actually have the Bani of Guru Granth Sahib, the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib recited in terms of you have to become a Khalsa, and the stirring of the sword, and the Batashas being put in, etc. It was very novel, and people did not understand it even at that time as well. It took time for people to have an idea of what the Khalsa means after trying to impart this world level. Now, you talk and mention about Oberoi. Oberoi talks about fluidity later on. He talks about it in the late 1800s. What Guru Gobind Singh is trying to do is and say there is that fluidity. And also what he's also saying is that, yes, we want everyone to be Khalsa, but different orders are still allowed to live and be allowed to actually live side by side, because it will take certain time for people to understand what I'm trying to achieve. This idea of everyone becoming Khalsa in 1699 and other years is simply not true. It takes a millennia of time, individuals, for everyone to become or think from a certain point of view. Even from the time of Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh was a millennia, if that makes sense. So I think that fluidity was there. The fluidity was there during the misl periods. The fluidity was definitely there during Ranjit Singh's period, and it continued. It was only this idea of a fixed construct during the time of Singh Sabha and the SGPC.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree whatsoever. Another question that is just off the back of something you alluded to was the fact that Guru Gobind Singh Ji's Darbar had Kavis that had been inherited from Mahtaj's father, Guru Tegh Bahadur Ji. Now, just then following that a little bit further, from your research, where does that kind of lineage of where does the lineage of patronizing literature start within kind of the Sikh setup?
In fact, it actually starts during the time of Guru Arjan Dev, actually, believe it or not, because he also had scribes and individuals. Kavis is probably maybe different at that time because it was more about solidifying the faith as well. So we can't say with certainty that there was lots of Kavis. But what we do have is the Tadi Darbar. So we have the Tadis which are trying to explain the concept of Sikh faith through their eyes. But we start the development of during the time of Guru Arjan Dev, Sri Hargobind Sahib maybe a little bit, but definitely under the duration of Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib, because it's all about understanding and getting individuals on board of what the final result would be. So there is that small development, but I think during the time of Guru Gobind Singh, it gets to his head because of the fact that in Paonta Sahib, when he gets to Paonta Sahib, he's trying to say, I want to create this symposium of individuals. I want to make my darbar as being a kingship, because in the spiritual sense, all right, fair enough, we have kings, we have queens, we have courts as well, because that's the way life is during that time and even now. But what Guru Gobind Singh is saying is, I want to impart art education, and I think it's the end result of the other gurus as well. We give credence to Guru Gobind Singh in terms of actually giving that opportunity to all this vast amount of literature that was created during the time, but definitely it was a gradual development.
Okay, no, fair. Just then moving back to the manuscripts and the primary sources that we were discussing about Sri Dasam Granth. So the second one that we had mentioned earlier was the Patna Sahib recension. That's dated 1698, again with handwritten pages from Sri Guru Gobind Singh Ji. So again, just in a nutshell, kind of what can you tell us about that?
Well, the important bit is that there's more than one Sarup at Patna Sahib. And this is where some scholars have made a mistake, because they started talking about a specific Sarup at Patna Sahib, but not realizing which Sarup they're talking about. So there's been several Sarups from an early period at Patna Sahib. There's actually one dated 1698, one not dated, but exactly in the same style as well. So it's not just one Sarup, we're talking about several possible Sarups from that time period. And essentially, it's almost like we can call it a finalized version of the Sarup of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. And yes, in that particular Sarup, it did have handwritten pages, or what we call Khas Patre of Sri Guru Gobind Singh in that Sarup. And just to put in context as well, with the Anandpuri bead as well, there was Khas Patre in that Sarup as well. And in other Sarups, so this idea of finding the Hat Likhta and certain pages was a later development, because it seems like there's always been this story in terms of when Guru Gobind Singh was crossing the river Sarsa, that all the Rachana of Guru Gobind Singh, the Kavis, all fell in the river. And it's a very predominant view, but it's simply not true. Because we have Sarups of Guru Gobind Singh, we have Sarups of the Kavis. What we do have this idea is that the Vidya Sagar, okay, there's this whole idea that there was another Sarup being created which incorporated the Bani of Guru Gobind Singh, the Kavis, called the Vidya Sagar. That was lost. And there's a possibility that could have happened at that particular time, but it wasn't the Sri Dasam Granth which was lost during that time. So the Patna Sahib Sarup is important. There's other Sarups as well. There's the Bhai Daya Singh recension of 1698 as well, and that's kept in Aurangabad. And there's many other Sarups as well from that particular time period, or a bit later, including the Bhai Mani Singh bead from 1713. And again, people like to nitpick and say, well, this Bani's not there, this Bani's not here. What we're talking about is very negligible in terms of what the differences are.
No, fair enough. Just then moving on to the other manuscripts or recensions that you may have come across. Just another one that I noted down from scanning through the Q&A book was the Bhai Daya Singh recension of the Dasam Granth. Again, if you could just in a nutshell tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, what's interesting about that Sarup is that there is the Zafarnama within that Sarup is actually a very, very nicely decorated. Okay, so within that Sarup, because as you probably know, Bhai Daya Singh was the individuals who actually had to present the Zafarnama to Emperor Aurangzeb. So that was the reason why Bhai Daya Singh has a Sarup connected with him, for instance. So that's the importance of that Sarup, and the actual design and the colourful elaboration on the Zafarnama within that Sarup is absolutely beautiful. It's a really, really great kind of thing to see, and just shows you what calligraphy, again, at that time was about. So it's a really, really important Sarup. But just adding something additional, just talking about the Khas Patre, which I think is really, really important, is that when we talk about Jata Pakyan and individuals stating that Jata Pakyan is not the Rachana of Guru Gobind Singh, what we find is that it was only several years ago that a Sarup of the Jata Pakyan in the hand of Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj was found. It's mentioned briefly in the essays, Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh, Essay, Lectures and Translations book. And because we only had limited information, but since that time, what happened was a Sarup of the Jata Pakyan was found, and now it's still there to inspect at Takht Keshkar Sahib, for instance. So it does exist in the hand of Guru Gobind Singh, and other folios, for instance, as an example, like we're talking about the the Anandpuri bead and other sarups have had the Rachana of Guru Gobind Singh or the Khas Patre combined with these sarups. So it's really, really important. And I want to actually just touch upon a little story as well, which is related to Bhai Mani Singh as well. Because I don't know if you're aware, but there's this chitti that was actually bandied about by many groups saying the chitti of Bhai Mani Singh talking about finding the Baniya of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib is an important letter. I don't want to go into the textual details of the letter, but basically what he was doing was he was communicating to some individual called Bhai Shia Singh, okay, where the Matas of Guru Gobind Singh were residing in Delhi. And the idea was that the sarups of Sri Dasam Granth were already created in 1698, for instance, and then by adding the Zafarnama, they were added on. But the Khas Patre may have been lost, not destroyed, there's a difference there, lost. And these Khas Patre, which is what Bhai Mani Singh was communicated to an individual called Bhai Shia Singh in Delhi, was what he was trying to establish and trying to find, and which they did eventually find. And these, which I believe are the Khas Patre, which are found in various other recensions in the various sarups of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib as well. So it's a very, very important point, because if you go to the Samads of the Mata of Guru Sahib, he actually even talks about Bhai Shia Singh finding and working with Bhai Mani Singh on the sarups of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, and that's in Delhi as well. So this connection about sarups does exist in the Ityas and even to this present day.
No, thank you for that. Just then, obviously, because we've been talking about early manuscripts, are there any others that you've come across that are worth mentioning and just explaining?
I mean, there's this connotation that when the sarups were either created by Guru Gobind Singh or other Shaheeds, whether it be Baba Binod Singh, we have a sarup related to Baba Binod Singh no longer extant, for instance. We can talk about the misl period in terms of Baba Deep Singh, and we have a sarup related to Baba Deep Singh, which is in Damdama Sahib as well. So they exist even to this particular day, but there's a very significant sarup from around about the early 1700s, which was sent to Afghanistan as well. And that's very important. It's no longer extant, which means we do not have it now. But Dr. Gunda Singh, great researcher, talks about seeing that sarup in Afghanistan. So, the early period during the early 1700s is surmounted with X amount of sarups, which either existed or do exist to this day. So there's fragments of compositions which still exist. So therefore, we can ascertain the development of Dasam Bani from that time. We can ascertain that it was a proliferation. Let's get this right. The idea that Dasam Sarups did not exist during the time of Guru Gobind Singh or later is simply not true. We have extravagant amount of recensions from that particular time and later on as well, because the scribe's work was that. So if we talk about Bhai Mani Singh, Baba Deep Singh, we talk about Bhai Shia Singh, we talk about Bhai Haridas, which I mentioned, which he never gets that light. There is several individuals who can be associated with sarups of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib.
Okay, I was obviously asking about early copies, early recensions, which I think we've explored quite nicely. Just then, perhaps getting your perspective on this, which is how did the Dasam Granth, I guess you've alluded to it previously, but how did the Dasam Granth develop historically, and are there parallels with how the Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji was developed?
It's a really important question and possibly not easy to actually answer, because there's various theories in terms of how Guru Granth Sahib, Sri Guru Granth Sahib was actually created as a great piece of Bani, basically. There's a mother theory of manuscripts, which is one manuscript leads to another manuscript leads to another manuscript, or there's certain manuscripts which create and develop to a finalized form. I think there's some similarities which I talked about, but there's certain dissimilarities as well, because we talk about Bhai Gurdas as being a scribe of Guru Granth Sahib, for instance. I think with Dasam Bani, it was work in progress. So if one of the earlier Banis is Jap Sahib, for instance, and you talk about and asking about an early manuscript, and we have an early manuscript of Jap Sahib and Bachita Natak, for instance, and they're just specific manuscripts, but what we tend to find is that I think the development of the Kavis was slightly different to what actually happened with the Guru Granth Sahib. And again, what you got to remember is it was Guru Gobind Singh which finalized Guru Granth Sahib and the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib as well. So he was the finalizer of both Granths in that time period. So even he had to actually look at the Bani of Guru Tegh Bahadur Sahib. You've got to remember that there was early Sarups which incorporated the Bani of Guru Tegh Bahadur earlier than what people think. So the traditional dates in terms of when it all happened. But what I'm trying to allude to is I think the development of Dasam Bani was slightly different to the way Guru Granth Sahib had actually developed. But it's not a good thing or bad thing or right thing or wrong thing. It's just the way it developed. But what we have to remember is that during the time of Guru Gobind Singh, he probably had more support and more individuals who were at his disposal to try and get the end result.
Okay, just continuing that then, what are the themes of the Dasam Granth and how do they harmonize or connect to the themes of the Guru Granth Sahib Ji?
Well, I've always felt that we have this concept of Meri Piri, developed during the time of Guru Nanak and formalized later on as well. We have this concept of Sant Sipahi, saint soldier. So the idea of the Guru Granth Sahib being Shanta Bani, and then we talk about the Dasam Granth Sahib being in terms of the martial Bani, we have it's in consonance with Sant Sipahi, Meri Piri, Sant Sipahi, it all leads to the same kind of ideals of what the Gurus were trying to do. So if we talk about Shant, if we talk about meditation, we talk about essence being in tune with the Akal Purkh in terms of the Guru Granth Sahib, the Dasam Granth has similarities but dissimilarities as well. Because the idea about the Dasam Granth is exactly what I was alluding to earlier on. He's trying to teach the common populace that, we do have concepts like Jap Sahib, whereby, and again, you may ask me this question about Shastra Vidya, but Jap Sahib is about the martial essence of how we live our lifestyle. It's still very spiritual, but it has that martial quality. We talk about Bajita Natak, which is totally different because it's historical. Apni Katha, Apni Katha, so Bachamo, which is about, I am now reciting my history in terms of my development. So it's a first-hand account of what Guru Sahib is saying in terms of where he comes from. And it's really important. So you have different themes, and the themes can be split up in terms of also spiritual Banis as well. So we have Savaiya, for instance, we have Jap Sahib, even though I said there's duality in that. But at the same time, we also have the martial Bani as well, which we're talking about in terms of Shastra Namala, for instance, portions of Krishna Avatar and various other Banis. But the important one which people miss is Sansar Bani, which is about the worldly Bani, which is Jirta Bhakyan. And the interesting thing is, if we look at a text called Sikhandi Bhagatmala, attributed to Bhai Mani Singh, that is the text which gets to the core of what the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib is about. And when one of the Sakhis at that time, what Bhai Mani Singh is saying is that the Sangat is asking the question, what do we make of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib? And he's actually saying exactly that. He's saying the Guru Granth Sahib is about about the Sant Bani, and Sri Dasam Granth is about Sipahi, and the merging of the two. So the idea is we are trying to make the saints into soldiers. And he's talking about the Bani being martial, and he's talking about Sansar Bani in terms of it being Jirta Bhakyan being a worldly Bani. We've got to remember this is in the early text. So the idea of Bhai Mani Singh putting into context what the Bani meant was really, really important. And, like I said, scholars may disagree with terms of dating, but it puts into context as to what the different types of Bani are represented within the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. And we can't look at it in the same vein as the Guru Granth Sahib because it's written in a different language as well. We talk about Braj Bhasha, for instance. Whilst it's written in Gurmukhi, in text is Braj Bhasha. And people ask the question, well, what's Braj Bhasha about? And again, what we have to recognize that Guru Gobind Singh Pasha was born in Patna Sahib. He had a vast range of learning in different languages as well. So that's one aspect to it. But at the same time, if you can compare certain portions of Sri Dasam Granth, is in conversation with the Guru Granth Sahib as well. So, you can look at certain portions and they equate to the Guru Granth Sahib. For instance, whilst we talk about the 24 Avtar, the 20 avatars of Vishnu, for instance, but Guru Gobind Singh quite categorically states that he only believes in 10, which is the concepts of Guru Granth Sahib as well. So there's X amount of ideas which are in consensus, but there's a kind of change because the change is in the mindset for the future as well. So I think there's a myriad of themes which is contained in the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. And again, it's for the learner to actually understand and see why Guru Sahib was trying to do this. We unfortunately have this lens of living in this living in this environment, or if you're living in the UK, or an environment in India, whereby you're looking at it of a lens which is within a modern period. You're not looking at the Bani within that time period, what the Guru Sahib is trying to do within the modern populace, trying to make saints into soldiers, and try to appeal to the common people, which is the key thing of what Sri Dasam Granth Sahib is about.
Obviously, continuing with Dasam Granth, we've spoken about early recensions, manuscripts, early granths. Obviously, the Anandpur bead perhaps being kind of the most talked about. What other ways were or was the Dasam Granth propagated?
It's a really great question. And again, talking about the development of Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, what I was trying to do when I was formulating ideas and concepts was not just necessarily the manuscripts, but also how does the Dasam Granth get disseminated? Okay, how does the people know about the Bani of Guru Gobind Singh? So firstly, what we have is we have the Sarups, which you mentioned. We talk about the Bani, which was recited during the time of Amrit Sajjad, for instance. And also, we have a third concept, which many people did not pay attention to for decades until I think I came up with this idea of transmission. So how do we transmit Bani through other sources? And I came up with this idea of Sikh relics and artifacts as well, because I've been doing this for nearly 2 decades now in terms of how Sikh relics and artifacts actually are employed to send a message. So let's just take arms and armour, for instance. Let's just take something called a jarena. Jarena is a Persian word for 4 mirrors, which is basically for plates, front, back, and to the side as well. One particular plate we know about is kept in the Toshkhana of Captain Amarinder Singh. And this was one of the first relics which I thought, okay, it's really important to actually get to the crux of, because it incorporates the Bani of Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. So we have Jaggi Sahib, we have Jap Sahib, we have another Bani from Guru Granth Sahib, and we have Akal Ustat as well. So the key idea is that there's a merging of, like I mentioned, if we're talking about Amrit Sajjad, we have this idea of Banis from both Granths being incorporated. And on the breastplate of Guru Gobind Singh, yes, quite categorically, it belonged to Guru Gobind Singh, is the same concept. And we also have these facets of actually Guru Gobind Singh trying to tell people the Bani is my protector as well. The Bani will protect me in warfare. So that's why he's wearing this particular jarena. We know this jarena was worn in the Battle of Bagani Sahib, for instance. We have within his Bani, within Bajeta Natak Sahib, that he talks about, the tir hitting the breastplate. So these are all information and concepts which are really, really important. So if we talk about specifically Jarena, that's a breastplate. Then we can also talk about other things like the swords as well. We have Sri Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh being put on the swords. And I'm going to talk about Shatan Mala in a second. But so arms and armour is where Sri Dasam Granth Sahib was propagated, because it's martial, it's warfare. So that was one idea. Another concept was Tamar Patre. Now, this was really fascinating for me when I was studying how propagation takes place, is that Guru Sahib, as you probably know in terms of writing, and we talked about Sarups earlier on, is how do you propagate information? And interestingly, copper plates or Tamar Patre was very popular in India at that particular time as well. So Guru Sahib had actually created in his own hand, or got scribes to write things on copper plates. So for instance, if you talk about Naina Devi, which is very much associated with Guru Sahib, there's a signature copper plate of Guru Gobind Singh in Naina Devi. You can even see this today now. There's another plate at Guru Kshetra, which was lost. The third plate is more important and is related to an area called Kapil Mochan, and it's on the trajectory of Paonta Sahib and coming down. And at Kapil Mochan, Guru Sahib was actually telling the individuals and the custodians at that particular time and giving them patronage as well. So what people do not understand is that Guru Sahib was about all people, whether they be Hindu, Muslim, whatever. And the custodians in Kapil Mochan were given a hukamnama, okay? They were given a hukamnama in a copper plate with the verses which come from Chandi Diwar, which is the Ardas, and it was given to the custodians at Kapil Mochan. The concept being that the words which I'm writing as part of the Ardas is the concepts that you have to take on board in order to make yourself spiritual. There's another hukamnama also there in relation to the Ardas as well. So the idea of Dasam Bani being proliferated at an early stage was done at that particular time, whether it be on jarinas, weapons, copper plates. But I thought this was really, really important, because what people missed was they were talking about Ityas, they were either talking about the Sarups, but I thought I would take it into another direction. And that's why my organization, the Sikh Museum Initiative, in 2016, we created a 3D version of the Charena of Guru Gobind Singh in 3D, and you can go to the website www.anglosikhmuseum.com and you can see the Charena of Sri Guru Gobind Singh in terms of in situ and in terms of what it looks like, because no one has ever seen that Charena, for instance. So the idea of dissemination is more about various facets. And remember, the secondary to that is the Hukamnama as well. So the Hukamnamas of Guru Gobind Singh, or attributed to Guru Gobind Singh, has the verses in relation to Dasam Bani, or talks about the recitation of Dasam Bani as well, where it's by Daya Singh's Reitname, for instance. So I think there is enough evidence from that early period of how dissemination of the Sri Dasam Granth Bani took place.
Just going back to the body armor, I just wanted to dig into how you've linked it, or how, like, what is the evidence or the provenance of the armor in order to prove it is Guru Gobind Singh Ji's?
Okay, so at this particular time, the Jarena is kept within the Toshkhana of Captain Amarinder Singh in Patiala. At the time when Patiala was being formed, Guru Sahib had a great affiliation to the forefathers of the Patiala family, going back to Baba Ala Singh and even before that as well. And various Shastras were given to the Patiala family at that particular point. So their recollection and information is that we have a number of Sikh relics and artifacts which are given to them from the Guru Gobind Singh, and which is true, they have a instruction in the handwriting of Guru Gobind Singh. They have the Charena, they have other objects as well. But like I said, the key concept of the Charena being real is in the Bajata Natak, because with the war in the Battle of Pagani Sahib, he talks about a tir hitting the Charena, and guess what? Lo and behold, there is a spot where the tir has actually gone through the Charena as well. So they're the instances where we can equate the Charena with Guru Gobind Singh. And I have no disagreement in my mind of that Jarena being in relation to Sri Guru Gobind Singh, being part of the Ityas, and if we look at it in terms of Patiala and their Ityas as well, it all marries up.
No, fair enough. Thank you for explaining that. It's obviously quite interesting to hear about it. Just then moving on kind of chronologically, we've spoken about early evidence, we've spoken about the armour of Guru Gobind Singh Ji, we've spoken about, say, for argument's sake, the Anandpur bead. Moving then into kind of the misl period, and then obviously the reign of Maharaj Ranjit Singh Ji, what evidence is there to show how Dasam Granth is utilised or transmitted during those periods?
Well, what we have is this period the misl period is fascinating. I know you alluded to just something Ahluwalia earlier on. And believe it or not, for the last several years, I've been working on the misl period itself. But I don't want to digress in terms of misl period and the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. But ideally, what we had was that the Buddha Dal, put this in an idea in people's minds. What we had was the warriors of Guru Gobind Singh. The idea of propagating to not just Dharam, the Khalsa was by the Buddha Dal, okay? What does Buddha Dal mean? Buddha Dal was the fifth roaming Takht, okay? We'll talk about Takhts in a second. But the idea of these Sarups were always kept within the Dal Panth, okay? Very, very important, because we talk about Sarups being lost, people, battles and things being destroyed, but the Sarups were always kept within the Buddha Dal. So the Sarups were always there, but what happened was they've been misplaced or they've moved from region to region. So in terms of one Sarup that we know about, and it's related in our particular books as well, is a Sarup called the Patna Misl Sarup, and it's dated 1765. Yes, it's quite of a different age and a different gap between the earlier Sarups, but what you have to recognize is that there was turmoil as well during the early infancy of the misls as well, during the time of Nawab Kapoor Singh, just as in Ahluwalia. So the 1765, we refer to as the Patna Misl Dasam Granth, is again the original or the initial folio has some elaborate kind of idea of what the Sarup's about. And also during that time is we have Bahadur Singh as well, which we know had been creating this Guru Ki Kashi, this concept of having a learning school at Damdama Sahib. So there's Sarups related to Bahadur Singh, and I mentioned earlier on, the one Sarup is even now at Takht Damdama Sahib. But more importantly, the Shahidi Misl, if we can call it that, of Bahadur Singh also had other scribes as well. There's another Sarup related to Jeet Singh, which is from the Shahidi Misl. And again, that, as far as I know, and I'm going to have to check, my memory might be out of phase here, still exists as well, but there is allusion to that Sarup as well. So there's various other Sarups during the time of the Misl period. They talk about Sarups disappearing during the Vadda Gulagara, which is the bigger Holocaust which took place, but at the same time Sarups were kept in custody as well. And also during the latter half of Sri Dasam Granth Sarups and Guru Granth Sahib Sarups as well, they were proliferated, but at a lower level because of the fact that there being warfare at that particular time. If we now move to the area of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, it takes a different turn because we have now stability. And also he subdues various misls as well. Now what people don't understand is that when you subdue the misls, you also subdue what they own as well. So he may have taken various Sarups, relics and artifacts from the different misls as well, and they would have been incorporated in his darbar. But what Ranjit Singh did was he also patronized Kashmiri scribes to actually create recensions of Sri Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib as well. So we start getting another style or version of the Sarups by the Kashmiri scribes and other individuals as well. So the proliferation just takes on another turn during the time. But also something to bear in mind is that Akali Phula Singh, who's there at that time as well, he ensures that the Gurdwaras have the Brahman, we'll call it Prakash as well. So Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth in Prakash all over Amritsar as well during that time. So it was just a merging of what was taking place within a peaceful time period. And people think and look at Swarups of all our Bani and look at them in a certain context. But, we have evidence. We look at the Ibrat Nama, which talks about Swarups of Guru Granth Sahib and the Sri Dasam Granth being carried on elephants. Okay, let's get this right, on elephants during the time of Maharaj Ranjit Singh, and the idea being that these are equals. That is what Maharaj Ranjit Singh is trying to portray. And there's nothing to say that it wasn't. There's no evidence to say that. In fact, it was the other way. The patronage was there in terms of many Swarups being created during that time period. And interestingly enough, and funnily enough, Swarups created during the time of Maharaj Ranjit Singh was sent to the kings and queens of England in the early 1800s. And they still exist today in the British Library.
No, that's really interesting to know. I wonder also, well, we'll get into how some of them ended up in the British Library a little bit later on, because I know you know a lot about that. But just before we move on to that, you alluded to kind of the protocols regarding the Prakash of Dasam Granth, and again you used some evidence there to elaborate on that. I just wanted to kind of open that up a little bit more and ask you, is there, like, what else have you come across in relation to the kind of, I guess what people would say, the Maryada of Dasam Granth or the protocols of Dasam Granth, just over history, not perhaps necessarily at any point in particular, although I'm sure you will point at its historic development and how perhaps the Prakash changed and developed. Obviously, the biggest change coming with the Singh Sabha. However, let's perhaps just leave the Singh Sabha to one side. Up until that point, what are the protocols, the Maryada, so to speak, around the Prakash and just in general around Dasam Granth?
I personally don't think there was any kind of distinguishing features in terms of Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth from this early time period. Like I said, the Bani of Sri Dasam Granth Sahib was created during the time of the formulation of Guru Granth Sahib. So individuals at that time, the Sangat, everyone would have been aware of what the Bani was about. So therefore, what we have is this concept from an early time period of this equation. Yes, we do have the Redname, we have praxis, which talks about Guru Granth Sahib being given the final formation, and we believe in the idea of having faith in Guru Granth Sahib. But at the same time, evidence also suggests, and we can even look at, I know it's of a later time period of Panth Prakash, for instance, talking about even during the time of Banda Bahadur, of botis being given to Banda Bahadur and then being taken to Hajur Sahib, for instance, and examples like that. But the point I'm trying to make is that if we look at literature like Bansavli Nama, okay, Keshar Singh Jibbar, and we're talking about misl period here now, and he's talking about the Vadda Granth and the Shota Granth, okay, so we're talking about Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, and in his mind as well, he's talking about the equation being simple, that there's an older or greater Granth and a smaller and a younger Granth, because he's talking about Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. And he talks about it as being equal and it being respected in the same kind of idea as well. So we have Ityas, which talks about the equalization of the Granths. In terms of the actual physical Prakash and the concept of how, and the Maryada in terms of what you're talking about is very, very important, because this relates to the ducts, for instance. So the supreme thrones of polity, what we call it, the ducts, for instance. So we know even to this day that we have Akal Takht Sahib, we have Patna Sahib, we have Hajur Sahib, and during that time, we also had the Buddha Dal as well as being a duct as well, because they were a roaming duct, for instance. But this idea of Prakash is a misnomer for the people who dispute it. And let me clarify this idea as well. I am not saying that since the time of Guru Gobind Singh that it was always the case that there would be a Srupa Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth together. We think that it would have been prevalent during the misl period because they believed in the same concepts and ideas, and the Buddha Dal represented this concept of Sant Sabha as well. Later on, Singh Sabha, or maybe even late Ranjit Singh period, we start getting this central idea of just the Guru Granth Sahibs. Sri Guru Granth Sahib. But let's just put in context what Prakash means. Prakash is the idea that both Swarups are in unison. If we go to Hazur Sahib now, we see both Swarups together, but Guru Granth Sahib is on a higher pedestal. Okay, just make this for the listeners' understanding. And Patna Sahib is slightly very in the similar vein as well. If you go to Nahang Dals, for instance, it's Brahman. There is no upper or lower because they consider it to be equal, which makes sense because they're from the idea or concept of the Buddha Dal. So therefore, we have this oral tradition as well. But what Akali Phula Singh did was, and it's really important, is people don't understand, is that all of our Mursar, because in order to have or to become a Khalsa, you could only do it at the Akal Takht Sahib. During the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, if you had to become Khalsa in Punjab, or maybe one location of Punjab, you had to go to the Akal Takht Sahib. And guess what? The both groups were there, and you could only become Khalsa with both Granths. And this is early 1800, well, we're talking about 1800 period. So therefore, we have evidence of that. We even John Malcolm, and I know you're going to talk about the Britishers' views, he talks about it. He quite categorically states what's going on there. We have other evidence sources saying that you cannot become a Khalsa without going to the Akal Takht Sahib, which was under the leadership of Akali Phula Singh, and the Prakash of both Granths used to take place. So this idea of Prakash being an anomaly is not true. The idea of the Prakash becoming less prevalent is true from the 1900 period onward. We're talking about SGPC time and 1984 period as well. There's very two distinct periods there. So I personally think there's nothing wrong in this concept. I'm not saying it should be prevalent. I just think there should be an understanding, because you do not have the recitation of the Dasam Granth on its own. You have the recitation of Sri Dasam Granth Sahib in the Hazuri of Guru Granth Sahib. Very, very important. This idea that people just read the Dasam Granth on its own is not true. It has to be in the Hazuri of Guru Granth Sahib, and that's why the Nityanam is about the combination of both Granths. You do not have the Dasam Granth in separation from the Guru Granth Sahib. And I think that is the concept about the ideas about the Prakash as well. And I think that's very, very fundamental.
No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Now, I just wanted to then move on to, again, you've alluded to, again, the British and also the Singh Sabha movement. And I guess I'm almost putting it all together in this because I think you can't quite explain one without the other. So just then moving the conversation into the British's view / perspective of Dasam Granth, the influence that then had on Singh Sabha and their view of Dasam Granth, how that impacted general Sikh practice. So for argument's sake, today, if you go to the Akal Takht Sahib, you won't see Dasam Granth. And then also the role of the Sodhak Committee, because I think, again, I was quite shocked when I was doing research during my university degree to even come across this committee. I never even knew it existed, and again, it was quite revelatory in terms of how we formulated modern Sikh practice, even around Dasam Granth. So again, just those three topics, really. I'll let you continue from them.
Let's break that down to three questions, actually. So I'll try and answer one and remind me of the others. But let's start with the British, for instance, this idea of the British, the Sikhs, and I've worked on lots of sources related to the British, not just in terms of Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, but just per se about the Sikhs. And my recent book, The British and Sikhs, you can comment on how great it is or not so great in your own words, but the idea that the British and the Sikhs did not have a connection over an early period is a misnomer as well. You know, we know about Banda Bahadur's Shahidi taking place and recognised by the British as well. But like we talked about earlier on, when my earliest phase, when I'd just been talking about my MA as well, when I talked about Gurbachan Singh Lamba earlier on as well, I was allowed to actually write articles for the Sansapai magazine in Jalandhar. And that was under the patronage of the, I think they called that, or the SGPC, which your articles could not be published if they weren't agreed with. And I wrote several articles on the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib in the early 2000s. And one of them was about an individual called Charles Wilkins. And Charles Wilkins was an individual who stumbled upon or was told about, it's interesting, told about this institution at Patna Sahib, and which we now know is the cradle and the idea where Guru Gobind Singh was born. And he visits this educational centre, and I'm using the word carefully, educational centre, because he does not understand the concept of a Gurdwara or a Dharamsala, as we may have called it even at that time. So what he's saying is, when I visited Patna Sahib, he sees the prakash of Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. He talks about the Shastras being there as well. He talks about various other practices, which is, you know, if you were to read the idea and concept of Charles Wilkins, it's exactly what we understand today, apart from the fact that, you know, both Granths are together. And the practices and the ideas were so important at that particular time. 1780s time period was the important bit for Charles Wilkins. We have other concepts as well, but when we get to Ranjit Singh's period, we get a plethora of information going, and we know about John Malcolm. And I really, really like John Malcolm's book about the Sikhs. It's a very small book, but interestingly enough, he talks about what I just talked about. When you go to Amritsar, you see the prakash of Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, because he's an eyewitness. What people don't seem to understand is it's not made up. He was an eyewitness to see the prakash at that particular time. Let's link in another British individual by the name of Dr. John Leyden. And I was mesmerized when back in the early 2000s, when I came across the English translations of Sri Bachata Natak, Prem Samara Granth, and various other topics as well, that a Britisher in the early 1800s had actually did a translation of Sri Bachata Natak. I was gobsmacked. I could not believe it. And the idea that he even says Sri Bachata Natak forms part of a wider work called the Sri Dasam Pashaka Granth. And this is the early formation of British views, which is the idea that the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib is the rachana, is the concepts, is the ideas, and is the order of Guru Gobind Singh. Early period. No one's disputing it. What we do have is a change during the time period after the Anglo Sikh Wars. But I want to allude to something now as well. During the Anglo Sikh Wars, what we do find is that you talked about sarups earlier on, but we have sarups of that Sri Dasam Granth Sahib found in the battlefield, which exists to this very day. We have one in Leicester, which I worked on in terms of our exhibition of the Anglo Sikh Wars. Okay, so it's a rachana of Guru Granth Sahib and Dasam Granth Banis taken from the Anglo Sikh Wars. And there's other sarups found which combines the Bani of both Granths as well. So what we're trying to say is the British were aware that in warfare, during the Anglo Sikh Wars, the sarups which were taken were from both Guru Granth Sahib and Dasam Granth Sahib. We have them now to this day. Shyam Singh Adariwala, in the battlefield, his sword has the rachana of Shastra Namala on his sword, and it was actually found in the battlefield. Still exists to this very day. So the British knew about these concepts of Sri Dasam Granth from the late 1700 period, during the time of Akali Phula Singh's authority and Ranjit Singh's period, to the time of the Anglo Sikh Wars.
Sorry, just a quick question. A common narrative that's often put forward is that the British purposefully misreported or kind of had an agenda to tear the Dasam Granth away from the Sikh community.
Let me explain
I
that.
just purposely want to frame this question because a lot of people kind of go with this traditional viewpoint, which is that the British had this agenda from the get-go. They're all really bad. And again, like you've alluded to, how history isn't just black and white. And they kind of argued that, the British had this agenda to get rid of the Biras because they knew that the Sikhs were a problem. And again, everything you said so far is brilliant in creating this really vivid image. But just then continuing with that, what is your perspective, I guess, of that kind of argument?
Let me explain. And so therefore we got to a point of the Anglo-Sikh Wars. So what we should allude to is this. And I think this is a fallacy of history per se. The Gora of 1900 is not the same Gora as 1800. The 1800 Gora is not the same as the 1700s. You may say the East India Company is all the same, etc., etc., etc. I disagree with that, and I point that out in my British and the Sikhs as well. Because if that was the case, then they would not have believed in the Biras and the concepts of Dasam Bani at that particular time. So therefore, what we have is a loss of information. Does that make sense? So just like you have loss of information in Sikh Ityas, you have loss of information in British understanding.
Would you perhaps argue that the kind of the objective of early British accounts was actually just to narrate and kind of share the information that was kind of coming to these people through their travels, and then perhaps later on then it's the kind of the objective changes in that actually Punjab is now coming up for like being conquered. Like, does that not affect the writer?
No, I disagree with that, because that seems to be a common narrative, because Charles Wilkins is not just describing, he's talking about specific. John Malcolm is not talking about a description, he's talking about specifics, very, very specific. We're talking about, in his book, he's talking about certain portions of Batitanad. This isn't, there's a composition of Guru Gobind Singh, we think it's warlike, there's no possibles. This is definitive, these are definitive facts at that particular time reported by the British.
No, sorry, what I meant by that was, do you think that later British accounts that perhaps are disparaging of Dasam Granth or whatever are actually because the objective for them in terms of the agenda has changed? Like as you mentioned earlier, accounts are very just objective about it. They're very clear that Dasam Bani is, for argument's sake, Guru Gobind Singh Ji's work, whereas some of them later on, and again, it's a common narrative which is portrayed, which is, because Punjab then came up for being annexed, the kind of the tone or the viewpoint of the writer is, or the objective of why these people were out there had changed.
Once we get to the point of annexation, we have a different mindset, because the British are now in a area of control, And like I said, there's a loss of information between the time of John Malcolm to the time of annexation. So annexation and beyond is looking at a different concept of what the Sikhs are about. So what we have then is, and it's in my British and the Sikhs book, they look at translators, And they look at translators like Ernest Trump to translate the Guru Granth Sahib, which he does to a certain extent. But the narrative, which people have forgotten, and the concept is, he was actually commissioned to translate not just the Guru Granth Sahib, but the Dasam Granth as well. And I allude to it in the British and the Sikhs book. And what happened was that Ernest Trump, even if he was a linguist, could not understand the concepts of the Dasam Granth. So he, again, and I'll say this quite categorically, like Sikhs, like his other British individuals, could not consider the ideas and concepts of what the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib was about, because it's not in context. So what he was trying to do was say, and he fell for that trap because he saw the Sikhs as being a martial race, and like a lot of British Sikhs did. And then when they saw the Dasam Granth, they start saying, well, hold on a second, there's talk about Dev, De and Devi here. Hold on. We want to separate the Sikhs from the Hindus. So therefore, firstly, I don't understand it, so I'm getting rid of it. I'm not interested in translating it. So the Dasam Granth project under Ernest Trump was actually put to one side. I've seen the letters which were given to Gyanis at that time as well. And basically some Gyanis are saying, yeah, we don't know what Dasam Granth's about, etc. Others were saying, yes, it's a Rachana of Guru Gobind Singh. So we start getting the first kind of departing of the British saying, well, we're not sure what the Granth's about. Post-annexation, this is later on to 1857, later on. But what we do find is that certain individuals are very, very clear in terms of what Dasam Bani is about. And I'm going to talk specifically about this idea about Shastra Vidya and the banning of weapons. In the early, let's say about 10 years ago, individuals were propagating that the British have banned the Dasam Granth. The British have said that you can't wear Shastras, for instance. Yeah, the Nahangs are finished. Nahangs can't wear Shastras, for instance. But what people have missed out is that it wasn't a specific Sikh thing. There was something called the Arms Act, which was created by the British in order to demilitarize not just the Sikhs, but India per se, in terms of you can't carry weapons, for instance, you can't be martial. But at the same time, the British were also trying to think, well, what are the key traits of the Sikhs which we can use for the British Indian Army? Okay, so on the one hand, you've got individuals who can't understand the Dasam Granth, but at the same hand, you've got individuals who are saying, okay, well, what is the martial prowess of the Khalsa? And guess what? Some of the early regiments actually quotes the lines from Dasam Granth as part of their mottos, for instance. So the early regiments had concepts and phrases from the Sri Dasam Granth. So what I'm trying to say, there's a mixed bag here. This idea that all of a sudden we want to ban the Dasam Granth, this, that, and the other. I personally do not agree with that assertion. There seems to be a lot of rhetoric out there, but there doesn't seem to be any evidence from it. What we do have is, yes, we have demilitarization. Did they want to make sure the power of the Nahangs were down? Yeah, absolutely, because the Nahangs from the time of Kalifullah Singh were the main opposition. Ranjit Singh was friends with the British. He was writing letters to them. They were in his court every single day, so there's no opposition there. Kalifullah Singh was the first people to attack the British when they came to Punjab. So the Nahangs were going to be finished. That was the whole idea. And the concepts might be deliberate as well. But this idea of banning the martial Bani, etc., it was just a byproduct, I would say, of what's happening. Not specifically. I've never read any English literature saying that we are going to destroy the Dasam Granth, we're going to burn books, etc. This is all fallacies. The British never did that. And I'm being very kind to the British in the face of the atrocities that may have occurred, the badness, taking Dalip Singh, getting rid of our empire.
No, fair. And this is why I enjoy doing these podcasts, is because not do I just get the pleasure of exploring kind of these topics with people who are actually quite frank and honest about it, but equally obviously because we're recording it, we can share this with everyone else, which is quite sweet, really. Something then, obviously, just continuing on from the British, then how did the views of the British then impact the Singh Sabha, and how did Singh Sabha impact just general Sikh practice in relation to Dasam Granth?
Well, I think I talked about the Arms Act earlier on, and in defiance to the Arms Act, the Akal Takht Sahib actually had a Hukamnama as well, which talks about making sure that you practice Shastra Vidya, make sure you're still in Gatra, and you still have the concepts of the Khalsa. This is during the British period. And I find it amusing almost that if you've got the Arms Act, you also have Hukamname from the Akal Takht Sahib saying that, yes, we still need to be martial because Sikhs are Sikhs. What we do have is this idea that the Singh Sabha movement incorporates, and now this is another take. So we're talking about the idea that the British is destroying Marshal Barney, etc. But what we don't understand is the fact that the British have influenced the Sikhs themselves. So we get to this idea of Singh Sabhas, which is a revolutionary movement against the British, well, no, not necessarily against the British, but against the indoctrination of Hindu themes proliferating Sikhi, for instance, and being a distinct and separate race. I personally think it was the British concept which has been put in within the Sikhs to understand that, because we know things are fluid. And people don't like this concept of Sikhi being fluid. They like it being fit into a box, okay? They like this box theory. This box theory of the Sikhs was an SGPC thing, 1920 onwards. Here is the Red Mirada. Here's what we believe in. Here's what you have to follow, 5Ks, etc., etc. Sikhi was never that. It never was during the time of Guru Gobind Singh. There was the time during Ranjit Singh, and it was very fluid. That's why you could have the Nahangs, you could have the Nirmali, you could have the Adasis, you could have various Sampradaya at that particular time. But they wanted to end it because it was a case of a homogenous Sikh. But interestingly, and this is where Oberoi comes in, and we talk about it a lot in our Dasam Granth book as well, is that these concepts which the Sikh took upon themselves were from British institutions. So this idea of the SGPC, which is Sikh, Guru Gobind Committee, for instance, is a committee. Committee word is obviously British, for instance. And other concepts were a British connotation of how the Sikhs were to fight the British. And again, it's really important to understand and put this in perspective. When the Khalsa went to battle with the Mughals and the Afghans, for instance, they had to incorporate certain strategies and ideas from the Mughals and the Afghans to battle them. And in this vein, in this idea, we also have the Sikhs actually having institutions which are British-like. So we have this dichotomy of Sikhs saying that we're going to shed our leaves and now we're going to battle or take on the British with British ideas. And as a consequence of that was, in the early 1900s, we have this idea that, okay, look, and that's something which I've not alluded to, is that the martial race as well, because in the military sense, the British were looking at the Sikhs as a martial race and distinguishing themselves from the Hindu as well, okay? So when we get to the 1920s period, they're shedding this Hindu connotations. It happens in 1984 as well, and I'll allude to that later. But it happens in the early 1900 period where anything which is the liking of or has connotations of Hindus, we're going to shed. And that's what happened in 1920, whereby, the battle took place at the Akal Takht Sahib with these individuals of the Sabhas, early formation of the SGPC, and Baba Kaladari. Let me put this in perspective. So we have the Prakash of Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib taking place at the Akal Takht Sahib. And individuals are sent to throw the Dasam Granth Sahib outside the window. Spears are thrown to destroy the concepts of the Nahangs. This is the worst travesty we can have in Sikh history per se. The idea of a reform movement calling themselves the Akalis, turfing out the real Akalis who are the Nahang Singhs, takes place in the 1920s. I allude to it. I've got evidence of it in the books where they're saying, you Akalis are phony, you're fakes, we're the real Akalis now, as in the SGPC, which is about to formulate. And this is these ideas which British based, because the idea of we're shedding these ideas of Hindu themed ideas was the basis on which these sabhas came about. We have these idea of the mahants, for instance. Oh, okay, so you've got a hereditary idea of whether you own a Gurdwara. It's really interesting. Let's just take the Ramgarhia Bungas, for instance. That was hereditary to the point of the 1970s. It's hereditary. And then the SGPC got rid of the family who was in charge of the Ramgarhia Bungas, for instance. I know them personally. But what I'm trying to say is that this idea that the Sikhs and the British were is a dichotomy is very, very true, because the concepts which the Singh Sabha movement actually incorporated are British. They're not Khalsa, they're British ideas. Even though it was trying to destroy or get rid of the shackles of the British, it was very much in a British vein. And as a result of that, the consequences was, let's get rid of the traditional orders. The Nahangs we're going to have to dispose of. The Sri Dasam Granth gets turfed out of the Akal Takht Sahib. It's absolutely unbelievable.
Just exploring that a little bit further, and perhaps connecting it to the Sodhak Committee, how does all of that relate, and how did or what led up to the events of the 1920s and this kind of watershed moment of actually getting rid of the Dasam Granth from the Akal Takht?
See, the Sodhak Committee is a very, very interesting committee because it's called Sodhak Committee. But it was created to actually not talk about authenticity. They looked at 32 Sarups of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib to look at variations. That was their goal, not authenticity, because that's where people get this fallacy. Let me just put in context as well. When they write in the report by Sadhu Singh, I think it was, what he writes is that we have Prakash already taking place. We already have Sarups within the vicinity of Harmandir Sahib and the Akal Takht Sahib. He's already talking about it being a common idea. So the actual Sodhak Committee idea is to look at additional Banis as well, because what we have is several Banis which we considered as being established. There was various other Sarups which had other Banis as well. And really, really importantly, that's why we also wrote the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh book, because it talks about, we'll use the word loosely, apocryphal compositions which are not in the standard Sri Dasam Granth now, but were very established prior to the Sodhak Committee. So what the Sodhak Committee did was they actually looked at the Banis from these 32 Sarups and said, well, we think X amount of Banis should be in a standardized version of the Dasam Granth. They did not say that certain Baniya were not of the Guru. They did not explain themselves in that report, which is baffling in itself. So we get a standardized version of the Sri Dasam Granth at that particular time. So it's up to the reader, the listener, to actually understand what they were trying to do. They never, ever, during that particular point, ever said that the Rachana or these concepts of the Guru within the Sri Dasam Granth is not of the Guru. It was more about trying to standardize something. I personally think it was a wrong move, because certain Banis were excised from that idea. But luckily for all the readers, we were able to incorporate the apocryphal Banis within the book, second book, which I'm talking about. So there must have been some ideas which had a bearing on what was to become. So early 1900s, if you talk about even Khan Singh Nabha, for instance, he talks about certain bits in relation to Sri Dasam Granth. We have Teja Singh Bashore, who absolutely wants to take certain Banis out of the Sri Dasam Granth as well. He creates his own Granth, buries it in the ground. It's just crazy what he was trying to do. He gets Shankar from the Pant as well, because even at that time, as much as the Sri Akal Takht Sahib and we had the reformers individuals still understood the power of the Dasam Bani as well, and the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib as well. But the idea that individuals, even though we had this attack on the Sri Akal Takht Sahib and the Dasam Granth at that time, did not mean that people did not believe in Dasam Bani going forward.
Earlier on, you alluded to how the Dasam Granth and this idea of sovereignty is quite prominent. And again, I guess it's also mirrored within the Guru Granth Sahib Ji. Now, considering the complex relationship the Sikhs have with the British, and especially considering they annexed Punjab, and as you rightfully said, they're not necessarily kind of persecuting the Sikhs on their own. The Sikhs are just being affected by kind of just wide-scale measures that the British are taking. So the Arms Act obviously affects everybody. But how does that ideology fit then, considering post-annexation, the British are essentially invaders? However, as we all know, the people on the ground had to some degree cooperate in order for this empire and this organization to run. And again, something that is, I guess, quite topical, because Sikhs in the army comes up again and again and again and again. Like, you're an advisor for a movie that is based on Sikh soldiers in the First World War. So I would love to get your opinion then on how that idea of sovereignty and being kind of Chakravarti and kind of Akal and beyond time and beyond these nation states and national armies, and then also this tradition of serving within these armies.
There's a lot of context in terms of the question you just asked, but I want to take it a little bit earlier, if that makes sense, because there's been a fallacy that in 1849, the Punjab was annexed, okay? I'm going to use the word fallacy because it's not simply true. The Punjab was technically annexed in the early 1800s when Ranjit Singh had to sign the Treaty of Amritsar and the Sutlej River. And I've talked about it in the British and the Sikhs, because what happened was that territory under the Sutlej was, even though Sikhs were allowed to actually govern as they were, etc., but they were still under British jurisdiction. And my problem with Ranjit Singh and the concept of the Sikh Empire is that the misl period had a larger territory. Okay, we had a lot of territory in the areas of which we call Daya, Pakistan, but our border was up to the point of the River Jamna. So the Korea Singha misl under Baghel Singh, we held various tracts of territory. Obviously, Ranjit Singh was very young and he did not understand this concept of the misls in terms of how much territory they actually had. So when he signed the treaty with the British, he virtually gave half of Punjab to the British at that particular time in the early 1800s. People hark on about 1849. Punjab was finished in the early 1800s because the River Sutlej. So let's just talk about the River Sutlej. You talk about all the families that you know about who lived under the River Sutlej. They were under British control. Whilst the British did not exercise military control, what they said was that the Sikhs cannot control that border within a certain designation. So what that means is that this idea of sovereignty was disappeared in the early 1800 period. That's why we had the Nihangs, that's why we had a Kalifullah saying, challenging Ranjit Singh and saying, don't let this disappear. Because our border was at the River Jamna. I'm working on the Sikh misl period right now, and I'm absolutely astonished as to how much territory was given away by Maharaja Ranjit Singh. Forget annexation. It's all about people talking about the British this, British this, British that. And before all of a sudden anyone turns to me and said, how come you're talking about the British in this light? Because I'm looking at the facts and I'm into the facts. And that's all I'm into. I'm not interested in having a narrative on what you believe and what's the popular narrative. If I believed in a popular narrative, I would not have even dealt with the Dasam Granth Sahib. So for me, we were dead in the water many years ago, prior to annexation. So what we have to kind of understand is that if we look at Patiala, Nabha, Jind, and Khalsia, people don't even know about the state of Khalsia. The Khalsia state was based on Baba Baghel Singh's. Remember, the conqueror of Delhi, his outpost was on the area of the River Jamna. We had massive kingdoms, okay, which were given away to the British overnight. So this idea of the British taking over the Sikhs and then incorporating them into the army was already there, if that makes sense, because 1846, 1849, the Gore had already had this relationship with these Patiala, Nabe, Jain, Khalsa, and all these, and even Kapurthala to some extent as well. Remember, Kapurthala is the house of Jassa Singh Ahluwalia in collusion with the British. And I'm not going to use the word collusion, it was normal. They didn't even think about this idea of inclusion or not in collusion with these people. It was just what was bettering their state at that particular time. So when you get to the time of annexation, we need Bharti, we need individuals for our army. It was the same concept as when the East India Company had gone into the early, in the 18th century and asked for recruits from the sepoys. They use the word sepoys in terms of other Indian individuals to prop up their army. There's no difference there. And I think our people have lost this idea or concept of you colluding with the British and not colluding with the British. It was always there.
No, that's fair. But then how does that perhaps interact with this idea of being sovereign then? Because if you're signing over your territory, and I guess this again also explains the tension between the Akalis during the reign of Ranjit Singh, because you're right, I think it was with Devinder Tood, he was discussing about how I can't remember who, but it was a British individual who was being shown around Amritsar, and the Akalis basically jump out and start throwing shit at them and beating them up or whatever.
Shaw. You talk about Augustus Shaw, who was a painter.
I don't know whether it was him or it was. I think it was actually someone in the British military, and it was quite illustrative of the point that actually, although the Sikh lead the leader figures in terms of Ranjit Singh or the other Sikh state may have perhaps been signing over their sovereignty, quote unquote, the Nihangs were obviously very much aware of the threat that the British posed. Just bringing that question into a bit of a more of a modern landscape, a lot of people, and it's an interesting debate to be in the middle of, and I guess it's also come up very recently, which is this entire thing of Sikhs being within the British military and how like one's oil and one's water and they can't necessarily mix. Like, again, I'm completely undecided on the opinion, and it's a question that comes up in a couple of the podcasts, but with someone of your research and the time you've spent doing like the breadth of research you've done, like what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think the key point here is that the Nihangs were the only protectors of the Sikh faith. Everyone else wasn't. But in saying that though, and again, I'm going to be a little bit negative here, and you will not probably possibly believe it, but I've put it in the British and the Sikhs book, is that the forefathers of Baba Deep Singh, okay, the Shahidi misl, they sided with the British as well during the time. So it's really interesting how we have forefathers of Baba Deep Singh siding with the British, but we have the Nihangs under Kalifullah Singh fighting the British. So I just want to bring that point to the fore, because I think it's important to understand who sided with the British, and it's more rather than less. This is a very, very important point. This idea that we do not have conversations with the enemy, this idea we do not have collusions with the enemy is a fallacy. It's always taken place from the misl period to day one, basically. The concept has always been this. The idea that we are a sovereign nation, okay, but we will have dialogue with individuals. Why do you think Kabul Singh was given the mantle and he had the Jagir from the Mughals, or I think it might be the Afghans or Mughals? He had the Jagir, but he had to go to the Panj Pyare, including Baba Deep Singh, to actually accept that. The idea that we having Jagir from the enemy is a purpose for a common cause for the future. The idea that Baba Baghel Singh on the board of Jamna Sahib was, he was dealing with the Mughals all the time. He was making deals. The Gora Singha missile, the Nishan Wali missile, the Ramgarhi missile, they all made deals with the Mughals. This idea that There was no chivalry. We have letters from the Khalsa to the Mughal Empire. We have letters from the Khalsa to the British, and they're talking about friendship. But they don't. But the point being is, they don't want to. People don't want to hear that. They want to make it that these people are common enemies. But what I'm trying to point out is, I'm not saying that the Sikhs want to be friends with the British, or I'm not saying Sikhs want to be friends with the Mughals. But there was this dialogue. And I think that's the most important idea, because dialogue is something that's missing from Sikhs now, because Sikhs sometimes cannot kind of have this dialogue with the Indian state. My concept is, and my idea is, that we should learn from this earlier period to say, as a sovereign nation, as individuals who can bargain and get what they want, did take place, and it should still take place to this very present day.
That's completely valid, and I don't think anyone has any questions about dialogue. And again, you've listed off a number of facts that support that, and there's obviously a lot more out there too. But I think the bit that I'm trying to get at is that actually after 1849, that this kind of like let's be honest, this idea of the Sikhs being sovereign after 1849, and again you've alluded to it beginning far before, is just null and void. There is no power base that the Sikhs can or are being able to talk from. And I think the difference between, for argument's sake, Ranjit Singh's empire talking almost on par with another nation state is very different to Sikhs then being enrolled in a quote unquote a foreign nation state's army, because that was initially how Sikhs would have been inducted into the colonial army. Again, we've spoken about how Jassa Singh Ramgarhia and how he was employed, for argument's sake, using just like an easy narrative, the army of the enemy. But there's still a level of sovereignty within that. But that's for me, I don't think that's the same as, for argument's sake, not having a power base at all. And I think that's what a lot of people perhaps would be pointing at, which is how does sovereignty continue then, I guess, post that period, considering there is no governmental structure, there is no Sikh power base, for quote unquote, there is no locus of sovereignty.
It's a good point. It's a good point. And like you said, the power base was with the Nihangs, and people always like to downplay the Akalis, trying to separate them from the Banth thing. There's some kind of weird kind of concoction or whatever it is, but the Banth was kind of after the Nihangs were kind of, after Akali Baba Hanuman Singh, during the first Anglo Sikh War, many of the Nihangs were decimated. It's just fact. So the concept of the Maryada, the ideas of the time period from Guru Gobind Singh were kind of eroding in the late 1800 period. But at the same time, what the British thought was important was to incorporate the Sikhs within their army. And you may think, well, why? You've just fought this nation, but what you've got to remember is that people had no jobs, people had no money, so what are you going to do?
I guess what you're alluding to is that the narrative is far more complex than just saying actually it's X or Y, because people have to, irrespective of framework or guidelines or whatever you want to kind of label it, there are still just human needs, being able to, put food on the table, for argument's sake. And so obviously forms of employment may have been limited, which again is completely valid. Just then, I guess, continuing with the theme of the British, I would love to get your understanding, because I'm sure you would have come across this in the work that you've done, which is, how did certain copies of the Dasam Granth end up leaving India and getting out, for argument's sake, to the British Library or to other institutions across the world?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And there's this idea that, I'll talk about it again in the British and Sikhs, this idea that all the Swarups were stolen by the British as well. I'm sounding like I'm really in the favour of the British, but I'm not. it's all about facts. I will always be on the level ground in terms of what's going on here. So again, my understanding of all Sarups and understanding of how things have arrived in the UK, I've been doing for almost 10 years, over 10 years, in terms of how relics and artifacts have arrived from the Punjab to the UK. Firstly, we have this idea, and I mentioned about Ranjit Singh's great friendship with the British in terms of when you reciprocate gifts and ideas. So, and it worked in the detriment of the British as well, because the British were giving cannon patterns, for instance, which Lena Singh Mujetia and, even the European Ferengi were incorporating to create a great Khalsa army, for instance. But at the same time, gifts were also given in terms of patronage to England as well. So Sarups, some Sarups, we're not talking many, we're talking about a couple may have come to England, which were given as gifts to the kings and queens of England. So that's the earlier period. We're talking about Sarups here, not necessarily Shastras and all other kind of stuff, because other things were gifted from the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh to the British, in the same way that things were gifted by the British to the Sikhs as well. This is called diplomacy. It's called about, it's the same thing which happened in India as well. So if you're meeting a Maratha, you meet a Mughal, Afghan, same thing, nothing different here. However, what we do have is a second period of annexation where the Tosha Khana of Maharaja Ranjit Singh gets ransacked, various relics and artifacts are taken, including Sarups. In fact, let me go a little bit earlier as well. So on the battlefields of the Anglo Sikh Wars, Sarups are actually found in the battlefield. So it leads to the credence that you have to have these Bania, you have to have these manuscripts in warfare. So we have Sarups, like I said, alluded to earlier on, which are found, and they're taken by the British as well. And they still exist to this very day in England. Annexation leads to the Tosha Khana being ransacked. Whatever's in the Tosha Khana, whether it's the Sarups, the Kohinoor diamond, for instance, we have jewelry, we have shawls, we have elaborate amount of wealth, which is taken by the British, is all taken. And it's all proliferated within various museums across the UK. We had the Indian Museum, which is a forerunner to the Victoria Albert Museum. We have things at the Tower, which is called the Tower of London, and that eventually led to the Leeds Armory formulating, and it dissipates across various museums across the UK. But there's another caveat to that as well. We talked about individuals siding with the British, and interestingly, later on as well, we have Shastras, for instance, being donated and given by Patiala, Jind, Kapurthala. We talked about these states earlier on also being gifted to the British as well. So this idea that everything that the British took was stolen is not completely true. They were gifted during the time of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. They were ransacked, and it's an absolutely unbelievable amount of wealth that the British took after annexation. But then many items were given by Sikh states to the British as well. So therefore, when it comes down to understanding Sikh relics and artifacts, human roots, it's very hard to ascertain, it's not very hard, but it's very important to understand that there were three phases of how items have arrived in the UK per se. And unfortunately, people get confused in terms of how this happens. And we need to make that distinction so we're very clear as to what's happened. Because if it took place during annexation, then it's really important, because we need to know what the British took and what importance that has within the modern day. But I think museums have had a change in their mindset in terms of how they portray and actually explore items. And obviously, as part of the Sikh Museum Initiative, for over 5 years, we've been working with museums across the UK, including some of the biggest ones, to make sure that we have a better understanding of what items they have and what it means, not just to the British, but to the Sikhs as well. And I'm not talking about repatriation, but look, with the work we've been doing with digital technologies, we've made objects come alive from UK institutions because they have faith in us to actually say that let's have a balanced approach to how we actually view these relics and artifacts. And I think that's a sensible approach, but at the same time, I understand the calls from India, Punjab, Pakistan saying these items should go back. But at the same time, we have to work with institutions to make sure they have Miranda as well. So when we worked with the University of Leicester, we've made a cradle for the Sarup. And again, it's a good class, we call it Bhoti, of Bani Sahib, Guru Granth Sahib and Dasam Granth. We had cradle made, we have like a covering for it, etc. So let's work with institutions as well, because that's important, because they have a better understanding of the value of Sikh manuscripts, relics and artifacts as well. So I think, it's an important point in this day and age.
Thank you for that. That's very, very insightful. Just one last question then before wrapping up, I guess, is have there been any successful translations? And if so, could you direct us to the one you would suggest is most accurate?
Again, it's very, very difficult. I want to talk about Dr. Jodh Singh, for instance. So Dr. Jodh Singh, Punjabi University, Patiala, a great friend of mine who, in the early days, I had a lot of sympathy in terms of where he was coming from, because he had to battle individuals in terms of what the debates were about. He did the first translations of the Dasam Granth in Hindi, for instance. Let's check this out, in Hindi. And it's interesting because the Hindu populace at the time said, well, this is absolutely fascinating because we've just read a Granth, which is so amazing, and the words and the concepts of the Dasam Granth by Guru Gobind Singh is mind-blowing. So he did something really, really, really important. If we're talking about English translations, we've had versions by Sundar Singh Kohli, for instance. We had translations by an individual commentary, I can't remember his name. We had online translations as well. Unfortunately, from my perspective, they still lack the depth in terms of what the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib in the right way should be. And don't get me wrong, Dr. Jodh Singh and Dr. Dharam Singh, when they did their translation, 2 volumes, was a start, but I still think to this day, there's never been, and you know what, people have been saying to me, Dr. Kamarup Singh, to do this kind of work. It's probably beyond our scope at this particular time, but we do need better translations. The problem is that the translations appear online, then they disappear. But I think the key concept is that we should try and read Dasam Bani anyway, in whichever context you have it, and at least get the essence of what Dasam Bani is about. Because once you've got the essence, then you can take it from there. Either read it in the original Gurmukhi, you can have a look at the original Sarups as well. But I would rather say, what does Dasam Bani mean in the present day? Okay, because we are removing ourselves from the court of Guru Gobind Singh. We're removing ourselves from the idea of Shastra Vidya, which we're not really talking about. We're removing ourselves from the idea of Rajniti, which is what Dasam Granth's talking about. We're removing ourselves from the idea that we are a sovereign nation, because the Dasam Granth's talking about being a sovereign nation. We're talking about this idea that the lineage from Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh is, one complete jot. This light, this concepts and ideas are the same. Because you've got to remember, in 1699, at the time of Khanda Dipal, they did not understand what Guru Gobind Singh was talking about, because it was far-reaching, it was worldwide reaching in terms of what Guru Gobind Singh was trying to achieve. This idea of merging the Sant Sabai into one, amazing formation of this ultimate warrior almost, you know what I mean, to use a phrase. So I personally think it's about reading, it's about understanding. It goes back to this idea of Sikhs being learners, it goes back to this idea of the Kavis and this important revenue of resources that we had even during the time of Guru Gobind Singh. Yeah, people talk about the internet, we don't have this, we don't have lack of this. And I talked about it earlier on in terms of being a field scholar. Don't worry about what you don't have, look about what you have at this time. Look at in terms of what you can do. And I think people have missed a big trick in terms of what the Dasam Granth Sahib represents to this very day and various age as well. People keep talking about Jatapakyan, but Jatapakyan is this moral ground of where you should move away from pitfalls as well. Because Jopi Sahib, a really important Bani, talks about this idea of this mess of the world that we live in. Kabir Bacha Jopi Sahib is about this idea that the Kavi, as in Guru Gobind Singh, is relating this idea that with all the fallacies, the nonsense of the world, we still believe in this concept of Akal Purkh. We will have this meditation on the Shastras, for instance, and we will lead to our Sikhs being, you could talk about sovereign nation, but lead to being individuals in society where we can keep our heads up. And I think that's what Guru Gobind Singh was trying to achieve with the Dasam Granth. Whether individuals understand it or don't understand it, and again, it's about your perception. But I personally think from my work and my research is that Guru Gobind Singh created a Granth which is so far-reaching, and it's so important that people still have not fathomed it to this very day. This idea of giving Rajniti, this idea of giving concepts of putting Dharma in context in terms of interfaith. We talk about Jyoti Bukyan. He's ransacked various philosophies and ideas all around the world as well to give it a context. I think it's unbelievable that Dasam Pasha, Guru Gobind Singh, has created such a masterpiece in world literature. Bani, you can call it whatever you want. It's just unfathomable to me. To this very day, I just find it very fascinating, very interesting. And it is something which, if Sikhs to this day do not understand, they really need to get on board, because they're missing this big chunk. I will call it a big chunk. Because you've got to remember, if the Prakash of Sri Dasam Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib took place at all the Takhts, for instance, it was an established practice. So in 2021, if you're saying we do not understand the concepts of the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, we do not understand the concepts of Prakash, it's not for me to tell you what you're missing, because in Ityas and concepts, and I talked about transmission, it's always been there. It's always been there. Unfortunately, what's happened is our scholars, our Gyanis, our Dharma has not been able to propagate this idea of what the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib means to the populace. Hopefully, the books that I created, Sri Dasam Granth's question and answers, the Granth of Guru Gobind Singh, and massive praise to Dr. Kumar Singh as well to give that additional concepts and the ideas behind what we're trying to achieve with these books is paramount. But I personally think it's been a long struggle. I personally think the mindset from the 1920s is infiltrated, I'll use the word infiltrated, the common Sikh, where they cannot see past a box where you fit in this box. If you're not part of this box, then you're not Sikh. And that was never the case prior to 1920, and that was prior, even during the time of Guru Gobind Singh. So for me, the concept of Guru Granth Sahib and Sri Dasam Granth Sahib is about the future. It's about how we make ourselves a sovereign nation, considering both Granth. If you don't consider both Granths, we're not a sovereign nation. The Dasam Granth is about a sovereign nation. If we look at Janelle Singh Bindrawale, when he's talking about the concepts during 1984, he's reciting from Dasam Granth every single day. So I do get confused, but at the same time, I'm very happy in terms of the way the world has changed almost in terms of the way we view Guru Gobind Singh. But as far as I'm concerned, I've been very blessed in terms of the knowledge. I think Guru Gobind Singh has blessed me personally in terms of taking this challenge. And I'll be indebted to Maharaj for giving me this opportunity to even talk about his Bani, because I don't consider myself to be anyone great. I don't consider myself to be anyone important. But during the time when it was very difficult to and challenge a lot of people in terms of Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, it takes its toll. It took its toll on me, it took its toll on various people. But I'm to this day very, very pleased that in 1997, when I took this journey in terms of looking at the Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, I will never look back. I will never look back on Guru Gobind Singh. and I never look back on Guru Gobind Singh Bani because it's of the major importance. And unfortunately, if you don't believe in it, if you do not, even if the masses don't believe in it, I don't care. Because personally, for me, this is the greatest achievement of Guru Gobind Singh to ensure that the Khalsa was, had its form. It's the most important Bani to ensure that we had a kingdom. It's the most important Bani to ensure that we could get through the worst scenarios of the 18th century, and to the point of giving Rajniti also to Maharaja Ranjit Singh as well. And that is, for me, the great colossus, master Kavi, Guru Gobind Singh.
No, fair. I just wanted to double check if there's anything in particular that you wanted to cover or include just before kind of wrapping up.
I just don't want this interview to sound like I'm very pro-British. Did it come across that way? I don't want it.
I wouldn't say it's pro-British. I think the beauty of these conversations is that there's the ability to have a conversation lends itself to being able to express nuance and actually be quite frank with the facts. And this is why I try to have these conversations with people who are in their fields. They've spent however long doing the research and the work. They've got something to show for it. So for argument's sake, the books that you've put out, and then having these conversations, because to be honest, I'm just trying to better my own understanding. And then sharing obviously this conversation with others is just a benefit of doing this. And so I wouldn't necessarily say you're a pro-British, but I think you perhaps are being honest to the sources that you're dealing with. And I don't think anyone can blame you for that. But no, if there's nothing else that you wanted to include, I just want to say thank you, obviously, for taking the time out to do this.
No, all I'm going to say is thank you very much.